The action unfolds in Seoul in the year 2021. The futuristic city rises with its skyscrapers directly into the sky. A few teenage boys standing in a bunch and probably about to beat someone up surrounding one poor guy. One of the students with square glasses looking into his notebook was pushing the others he could be so late for the academy. Another guy about his age, scratching his head nervously, curved his head in displeasure. The same guy with glasses named Jae-min walked past without even paying attention to his abusers. From behind heard laughter. It seems the bandit leaders just ignored Soo-hyuk. The main one was just shaking with rage. Finally, he couldn't stand it and turned around and yelled for that kid to stand still and come back immediately. He had already lunged with his fists at his victim. However, the guy with glasses didn't even think of stopping or even turning around. Finally, he sighed heavily and closed his notebook. Those pesky hooligans were getting to him. Before Hyuk could take a couple of steps, he was hit in the jaw by a powerful leg kick and immediately lost a few teeth. After flying a few meters, he fell to the ground and tried to put his brains together. The blow this kid had was really strong. Min only looked at him and smirked naturally. These bandits wouldn't be able to compete with him. Hyuk, holding his bruised head, continued to cringe, his head ringing, and he couldn't even figure out who had hit him so hard. The student was just as calm. He continued to breathe heavily, and his face clearly showed irritation. The bully looked down at him and smirked at him even though he was acting like a tough, but really that weakling. The calm, bespectacled man just wanted to say something else, but didn't notice how one of the bandits with a bat in his hands was already approaching him from behind. The next second, the poor guy felt a powerful blow to his back. He leaned forward and almost lost consciousness. The others had already begun to cluster around him and squeeze the ring to his end. That's for sure. The main bandit sat down near his victim and began to mock the poor guy. Now they will take away all the money from him alive. He will not leave here alive. Min realized that he had a bad morning and was surrounded by so many bullies that he would not be able to cope with them, but he still resisted. The chief bully grimaced. This kid still didn't realize what was in store for him. Hyuk was boiling with rage right before his eyes. The next second, he ordered his associates to take care of this unfortunate man and make sure they didn't leave a wet spot on him. He turned away from behind, hearing the sounds of thudding blows. The whole gang was beating the unfortunate student. Suddenly, something changed. The air suddenly became more dense. The bully looked in front of him with surprised eyes. Everything around him lit up with purple colors, and the bandit stopped and started turning his head in different directions. More and more it turned out to be strange to him. Around began to fly some strange sequins, as if carnival was beginning. He looked at his associates engaged in beating the hapless student, while light continued to develop around him. Eventually, the others also saw the strange light, and were already turning their heads trying to figure out what it was. Something brightly began to glow. Hyuk raised an eyebrow. He didn't realize what it was, or what it was. At last, Min was able to get to his feet, but he was still alive, although he had been beaten up badly, and his body ached. The poor man had no sooner risen to his feet than the heavy foot of the bandit came down on his head. Suddenly, another man with black hair appeared beside the main bandit and smiled. Nothing has changed here in 2 decades. Seeing the stranger beside him, Hyuk turned his head to him and asked perplexedly what was going on here, but the strange guy was still standing there. He started to look at the student and noticed that his uniform hadn't changed either. The bandit still couldn't figure out who he was. Offended at being called a bum, the stranger shrieked, "At least they know who they're attacking." It seems like everyone else is starting to realize it's a senior from their school and what to do. He's going to bury them all. Fortunately, Ming was behind and he could already calmly come to his senses. The guy corrected his glasses and looked at the strange man. The one in turn smiled. In principle, he did not care, but how can you leave your friends without such attention? Eventually, Hyuk couldn't stand it and poked the strange stranger with his finger and told him to go where he was going and mind his own business. He continued to sling mud at the stranger, and the stranger just stood there listening to him without saying a word. In the end, when the rude student had finished, the stranger snorted, "What a nasty bunch of young people they are." When the student tried to hit him with his fist, the stranger grabbed his arm and said he would break it if it happened again. Unable to tolerate such insolence, Hyuk had already swung his arm and prepared to teach this guy a lesson that was more useful in his business. The bully's hand was already approaching the face of the strange stranger, but he stood still and did nothing. But as soon as the bully tried to hit, he missed. The guy didn't quite realize what had just happened. The same guy was already at his back, but how could he move at that speed? Showing his hand in front of him, the strange man said that these people will get what they deserve, but before they see something frightening. He put his hand forward and began to utter some words in an incomprehensible language that poured from his lips like a river. The other students looked at him in surprise. Nothing happened, even after snapping their fingers. Everything around them froze in place for a few seconds, an awkward pause between them. Nothing happened. The stranger stood where he was and looked at his hand. Nothing happened, no matter how hard he tried. He started snapping his fingers in different directions. School children asked what he was doing. What the hell is this stuff? The man looked at his hand with surprised eyes, and Hyuk only sighed, as if he was another madman. The guy grimaced even more. What kind of day is it today? First one, then the other's crazy. Something about this is not clean. This bespectacled guy is trying to contradict them. Now there's this weird guy coming from somewhere. While the students were talking among themselves, the stranger kept snapping his fingers in different directions, trying to summon magic. Eventually, he got tired of doing this, and the guy stopped looking over his shoulder at the strange children. As soon as one of the hooligans tried to approach him, the stranger snapped his fingers and punched the man right in the forehead. The impact was so strong that the schoolboy flew several meters away and crashed into the wall with a loud sound. His head went black. Surprised to the core, Min looked at all of this and didn't even know what to say. Never had he seen such power. Crunching his knuckles, the stranger looked at them with a good-natured look and asked who's next. In the end, all three bullies were lying on the floor almost unconscious and only shaking with fear. They had not expected this. The biggest one of them hit the wall and sat there like he was asleep, but the guy was actually unconscious. Min, who had now been almost sent to the other side of the world, was now looking with admiration at the strange stranger who had knocked everyone out with one finger. Meanwhile, the strange man stood looking at his hand as if trying to see something unusual there. With one lip, he whispered that the discipline lesson was over, but it was still a mystery who this strange type was. The frightened Min got to his feet and thanked the strange man with trembling lips. The strange man took a closer look at him and wanted to say something. He certainly wasn't interested in how the student felt. Min really surprised when he heard the question, "What day is today? Is it really some kind of city madman?" Next, he started asking, "What year and number is it today?" From afar, it looked like he was not from our world at all. But when he heard what year it is today, the stranger opened his eyes wide in surprise and froze in place, as if he had heard something incomprehensible. He began to mumble something about being summoned 2 decades ago. Min continued to look at him with surprised eyes and understood nothing. He mumbled something to himself, but the student continued to stare at him with an unbroken gaze. Eventually, it seems he got bored of thinking, and the man with the black hair waved his hand and said he was leaving. As Min continued to stare after him, he wondered who he was that had scattered everyone. And then he started snapping his fingers, trying to summon the teleport like some sort of sorcerer, but all to no avail. The man turned around and looked at the student for a few seconds. Without moving from his seat, Min was scared again. To his horror, the stranger began to approach the student quickly, not in steps, but why is he walking towards him? Taking a few steps closer, the man asked what the student's name was. Min shakily said his name in a voice already preparing for a fight. He still didn't understand anything. Who this man was, where he came from, and what he wanted from him looked strange. To his great horror, the stranger asked if Min had any money. Here we go again. Now he will be robbed again. The man started whispering about being drafted too early and not being able to use magic. The student was shaking with fear again. The madman said something about teleport and magic, but Min already realized that he was just trying to rob him. In the end, this strange man asked the student for 5,000 won. Not much, but enough to cover the cost of transportation. The man was walking down the street and thinking what a good student this student is. We should thank him somehow. He looked at the reflection of himself in the nearest window and shuddered slightly. Lucky it hadn't been that long. The family probably should have recognized his dad is now 50, and he himself is somewhere around 24. He walked a few meters and suddenly stopped surprised, spinning his eyes in front of him. Something was wrong. On an ordinary city street stood the military. But why are they here, and also in such numbers, almost a whole platoon? Seriously, what is going on here? The guy scratched the back of his head in bewilderment and tried to think of something. 2 female students were passing by him, and the stranger decided to ask what was wrong, and the girls stopped. Why is there a military man here, and they are standing at the entrance to the underpass? What happened here? The students looked at each other as if trying to figure out what was wanted from them. The pause lasted a few seconds. Then they laughed. Well, of course, there will be military men standing at the entrance to the dungeon. He came from North Korea. With that, the female students retired to their own affairs, leaving the stranger utterly bewildered. Then the guy walked a few more steps and found himself in front of a locked door with a massive lock and chain hanging from it. He looked even more closely and tried to figure out what was going on here. He stood in front of the locked door for a few more minutes, scratching the back of his head, not paying attention to anything around him. Turning his head, the guy noticed that there were keys on the nearest table. Maybe they're from this place, we should check it out. It was closed here. I walked a few more steps, and the subway has been out of service for a long time. Suddenly, a notification appeared in front of the guy that he had made it to the station's first entrance to the dungeon. And only now he remembered those words of the girls, that there is a dungeon here. Maybe it's really true. The guy's got a grip on the monster's head at the usual underground station. Whatever happened to the earth in the meantime? He reached for the exit, but suddenly there was an electric shock between his fingers and the bars. Again, the sign appeared. The man raised his head, which means we need to find the return stone to get out of this place. That's good. Suddenly, something seemed to him as if something was coming at him from the darkness. Maybe the monsters were really coming this way. There is definitely something there. The man tensed up. Someone was approaching him and very massive. Suddenly behind his back, there was some kind of entity that looked like a big wolf but red in color, and the guy tensed his whole body. The wolf missed and stopped a few meters away. His eyes glowed with a bright yellow light, and his mouth was full of sharp teeth. Putting his hand out in front of his face, man decided to use the curb to at least somehow stop this monster. As expected, the monster continued to leap at him, opening its wide, toothy maw and preparing to devour him. The guy jumped aside. This wolf was very agile despite its size and had to be dealt with somehow. Suddenly he looked closer and saw something familiar in the features of this demonic creature. Red fur, yellow eyes, and big ears. For sure it must be Drebit. Seems to be a guy already encountered such monsters before. Moving his eyes to the side, the man luckily noticed a nailer, an ordinary construction tool, but now an extremely necessary thing. He made a leap and grabbed the metal handle. Now he had at least some weapon to deal with this monster. The wolf was already preparing for the next throw. The energy this animal had plenty of needed to do something about it. The guy's feeling better now he can play. The main thing is to deal with this entity as soon as possible. The beast had already opened its toothy maw to devour the hapless lad, and all he had to do was make a final dash for it. But as soon as the wolf lunged at the man, he immediately felt a powerful blow. The stranger destroyed him in one go. But that wasn't all. Several more monsters appeared out of the darkness, and the man began to swivel his head. There were 4 or so wolves in a coordinated pack approaching their prey, their growls heard everywhere. But that only whetted the man's apprehension. He smiled. These guys seemed to have lined up right for him. The only thing left was to deal with them. After all, the monsters were already lying on the floor. These monsters could be dealt with easily, but if someone else showed up, there would be trouble. Suddenly, there was another system notification level has been raised. Yes, you've got to be kidding. It's that pumping is still something. On the other hand, there is nothing wrong with getting stronger while these creatures are running around town. He just became a newbie. But on the other hand, the person saw that he had the same necromancer class that he had in the past. Right now, he needs skills. There was also like some online shopping conveniently, by the way. We need to raise the characteristics because the points to buy the skill are still not enough. He reached his hand straight for the notification. After the improvement, the characteristics increased significantly, and the guy himself felt that his strength had increased. The man looked at the nailer, and the weapon he held in his hands was noticeably more powerful. After waving it a few times, the guy realized that it was now a pretty powerful weapon. Quite a good smile appeared on his face. The goal is at least clear need to destroy as many of these monsters as possible and raise the level. So, let's go. The guy looked at the darkness in front of him and moved in without delay. You need to destroy about 5 more of these wolves to get a new skill. Speaking of wolves, one is already here. The monster ran straight at his victim, and breathing heavily, he could smell the human and wanted to eat. The kid's already got his nailer ready. Finally, the monster runs right into his hands. All he has to do is get rid of him, and it's a done deal. Monsters turned out to be much more, but now it was possible to acquire 2 skills, search and tracking. Applying the search skill, the man realized that there was no one else here but him and a few bodies of defeated monsters. He looked around the corner and saw a few of the same monsters, and there were even more of them. Doing this alone was really dangerous. He gripped his improvised weapon even tighter and needed to find someone to team up with him. We need to distribute the points between Mom and Control so it will be noticeably easier. The smile itself appeared on her face. The guy held out his hand and began to summon his fighting light around him, a dark aura spilling out around him. Well, finally his most useful skill will now have its own army to do something about it. A few seconds later, there were several skeletons on the floor and they were only level 1, but that was something. Raising the tire iron upwards, the strange guy commanded his ghostly army like a real warlord attacking the monsters. But the wolves were much stronger than expected. They destroyed the skeletons one by one, their powerful jaws grinding the bones into dust. Realizing that this would not work, the boy shouted for the skeletons to block them with their bodies, enough to repel the first dangerous attack. And choosing the moment to destroy these monsters himself, he began to swing his weapon. And the rest of the monsters can be used to summon their own soldiers. The guy extended his arm and started summoning skeletons. The wolves continued to pounce on the skeletons and destroy them, but it was just to their advantage they would block the attack with their bodies. The guy himself lunged straight into the crowd of monsters and began to destroy one by one with deft blows of the tire iron. Eventually, the monsters were defeated. Now we could go home. All that remained was to find the Stone of Return. Just about it, in the distance in the darkness, something began to shine bright red glow. Guy looked closely, and here is the right stone. At this time, at the other end of the dungeon, another person came out and was breathing heavily. He thought that everything would come out. The guy walked closer to the grate and saw that it was open, and someone had snuck into the dungeon while he wasn't here. The civilian was inside. It seems this man was a security guard. He was pretty scared someone had gotten in. Oh God, he's gonna get skinned by the brass if they find out a civilian's been trapped inside the dungeon. Okay, we just need to get help quicker, man. Pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and started dialing the number of the rescue service. Suddenly a portal appeared from which came out the same strange man in ragged clothes with black hair. The guard only looked at him with surprised eyes as to what this guy was doing here. And then an unbelievable thought came into my head. Maybe it's the awakened one, really. Otherwise, how would he have gotten into the dungeon? In the end, this time was also a very good catch in the bag, lay a few dozen red stones, quite expensive material. Another seeker rejoiced. He does not participate in guilds, and all the profits can be taken by himself. It is just fine, although risky. Oh, and the black market will give you a lot more money for this thing than a normal purchase. He laughed with joy. Suddenly, an unfamiliar voice was heard from behind. The man flinched in fear. Someone was definitely calling him. The silhouette of a man appeared out of the darkness. The man looked closely. Someone was following his footsteps and was definitely following him. A beautiful girl with red hair appeared out of the darkness. Her name was Lee Yoonhee. She was the commander of one of the strongest guilds in Korea. And only then the loner realized what a trap he had fallen into and that he could go to the other world at her very minute. Being caught by monsters is much better than running into this girl. She, in turn, offered to go together. Apparently, the poor kid's only chance was to escape, so he immediately started using the return stone to get out of here. He wasn't going to give up so easily. The man swung his arm and launched several energy shards right at her. Yoonhee lightly dodged to the side. Her eyes lit up with rage as this kid dares to cross her. In the meantime, the loner was already running towards the exit. All he had to do was get to the grate, and then it was all over. But a woman immediately appeared in front of him with a smile on her face. Well, if he doesn't want to join, then go to the other world. A few quick punches, and the unfortunate one was already on the other side of the world. Yoonhee worked as fast as possible. She was an experienced seeker after such novices. But luckily, the guy survived. He hid behind the nearest wall and was breathing heavily. Yoonhee was walking around somewhere nearby trying to find him. Suddenly, the girl pulled out her phone from her pocket. Someone had sent her a text message. Her face changed with surprise. Meanwhile, our hero has already got out of the dungeon and was walking down the street thinking about which bus he should take. He kept thinking the world he knew before had disappeared. The monsters had become very different, and for some reason appeared here. Now, our real world is similar to the Aphon world our hero was in until now, and from which he was called back here. What happened over the years? For some reason, the military guarding the entrances to the dungeon, yes, and where the dungeon came from in this world. Finally, he came to the very spot, but stopped a few paces away and looked before him with surprised eyes. To our hero's horror, his own house disappeared in the very place there was a huge skyscraper rising straight up into the sky. It's too late to look for his family now. They've probably moved somewhere very far away. The guy's head is on straight. Suddenly, the rumbling of his stomach interrupted his musings on the other side. He hadn't eaten anything today, needing something to snack on. A few minutes later, our hero was already sitting in a local eatery and eating flavorful noodles. This street food seemed to him the most delicious thing in the world. The guy grabbed his stomach and exhaled heavily. Just beauty. He doesn't have time for internet and coffee. He could sleep in the subway or something. It's crawling with monsters. Bad idea. The guy wondered what he'd do for a night out. Nothing better came into my head than to go and beg money from ordinary passers-by with a formidable look in order to raise money for something. Suddenly the doors opened. Our hero looked back with surprised eyes. Who else has come here at this late hour? In front of his eyes stood that very same kid. Min's student stared in front of him with surprised eyes frozen in place. It was that very same psycho. What is he doing here? The guy took a few steps back and prepared to run away. As luck would have it, our hero jumped up from his seat and grabbed the kid by the shoulders. It seems the gods favored him. He immediately jumped up to the frightened student and started asking him where his parents were and where he lived. Min already realized that he wouldn't get off that easy. Hearing that the parents of the boy has long been on the other side of the world, Our hero wanted to be happy, but then hesitated and sighed heavily. Min looked at him with a serious look and didn't understand what he wanted from him, although he had already guessed. Without waiting for a response, our hero said with a smile on his face that he was going with him now. The student, who still didn't understand anything, raised an eyebrow. What is this psycho talking about where he was going to find him? Our hero smiled home, of course, but not for nothing. He took the schoolboy's hand and put something in his palm. There were 301 coins lying there. Maybe he wanted to pay the rent, but it was definitely not enough. The student wanted to say something else. Wait a minute, it's his own money, but suddenly something flew by. This psycho, though he was crazy, moved pretty damn fast. He blew on his hand and said he spotted a fly somewhere. Min now finally realized that he is finished, and it is better to agree with this madman. Our hero said that will definitely return everything. Our hero's name was Kang Woo Jin. Less than an hour later, he was already standing in a cozy room talking to some man. They must have known each other, because the man saw Jin and was surprised to see that the kid had survived after all. What a joy. Jin was smiling too. He was happy to see his teacher, whom he remembered even after 20 years apart. The teacher said that after the guy disappeared, everyone thought he was on the other side of the world. Jin confirmed that he was, but he came back. Suddenly, the guy said he needed an urgent look at the student list. Can this be done? The teacher raised an eyebrow, but still nodded. Eventually, they came to class number 32, and it was full of students, including the familiar Min and a gang of hooligans. Hyuk turned his eyes toward his new victim and prepared to attack. He already knew that no one would get away. The guy walked with a confident gait and as if intentionally knocked one unsuspecting girl off the road. Bandit walked up to his victim and put his arm around the guy's shoulder, saying that he had a good day yesterday, but they were interrupted, but nothing, they will continue now. Whether the conversation should continue or not, Hyuk moved even closer to the guy and whispered literally in his ear. Not wanting to make any more noise, Min said that he understood, but there was no need to make a fuss in class. He already realized that there would be another fight. In response to such insolence, the bandit had already decided to attack again. His underlings were surrounding the unfortunate student. He grabbed the unsuspecting Min by the hair and wanted to put his face right into the desk. But suddenly, they were interrupted again by a stern voice ordering them to stand where they were now. Jin appeared on the doorstep, wearing his usual modern clothes and smiling. It was the same Hyuk from yesterday. He was terrified of where he came from, right in front of the school, who let him in. However, Jim wasn't even going to have a conversation with them, and smiling, he ordered all 4 of them to follow him. The students also gathered in a bunch. The older one called this bully and his company for a fight. He's crazy. The focus was directly on Jin and Hyuk. The latter was swinging his fists in an attempt to hit, but Jin was dodging. The opponent's movements were too slow for him, like a snail crawling when he finally starts to hit. While his opponent tried to get in Jin's face, Jin kept pondering. He clearly didn't know his place. This schoolboy reminded Jin of a Cassis acquaintance. Being a bloodthirsty necromancer, he only summoned the souls of sinners. At one time, this man tried to frame Jin and turn him against the Union in every way he could, a very despicable person. Eventually, Hyuk ran out of breath and looked at Jin with furious eyes like a bull at a red rag. And Jin, in turn, just smiled. He did not see a threat in this man and just wanted to have fun, pointing the schoolboy to his seat. A furious Hyuk looked at his charges and shouted for them to attack, but his friends were in no hurry to do so. In the end, it worked on them, and the guys, not without fear, rushed at Jin. The same stood in his place and just waited. We need to return the favor tenfold. Just crush them with our power, so they never think of anything like that again. Jin didn't even think about seriously attacking them. He just slapped them so hard that they went flying like confetti. Here comes another loud slap, and one of the bullies is already flying sideways at high speed, spitting out all his teeth. Then Jin looked at his main rival for what he was worth. Let it fit, Hyuk somehow did not hurry to approach. Eventually, fury completely obscured his eyes, and the guy moved right at Jin, swinging his huge fists. In the end, it was over. The whole company was lying unconscious for the usual trash. They are some too loud. Suddenly, Jin looked closer and saw something interesting below his eyes widened this phenomenon. The woman getting out of the nearest cab reminded Jin very much of his own mother. Yes, indeed, it was her. Her face was extremely anxious, and she was also breathing heavily. Probably she had learned something very important. Eventually, Jin was reunited with his mom. The woman hugged him and held him tight with tears in her eyes. According to his mother, right after his disappearance a few years ago, dungeons started appearing on the ground. At that time, little Jin did not suspect anything. His father went to the other world on the way to work, and his mother had to take care of his sister Su-ah alone. Jin was very upset when his mother said she would take her daughter to kindergarten and let Jin stay here. And now Jin found himself in his own room, a room he hadn't been in for decades. Everything here was completely different. He could feel how hard it was for the mother to take care of the family alone in the box. He saw something. There were things that belonged to Jin and his father. His mother couldn't throw them away and couldn't bear to lose them. Realizing the reason my mother couldn't throw these things away makes my heart flutter. Eventually, Mama herself returned along with her sister. The little girl looked at her brother with big eyes. Jean smiled good-naturedly. The guy was very happy to finally see his family after a long separation. The guy stroked his little sister's head and said he changed her diaper when she was just a baby. Sue, very embarrassed. She said that she no longer walked under herself and even took a little offense at her older brother. Mother suggested to play with her brother while she cooks something to eat. The girl wondered, isn't she going to go to the restaurant today? As long as they didn't talk, Jean just looked at his family and rejoiced. He was very happy to see them alive and well for the first time in a long time. Eventually, the day came to an end, and the whole family went to bed. Jean still couldn't sleep and was tossing and turning in his seat. 2 decades ago, he was summoned for no reason at all. It was a completely different planet, a completely different world inhabited by monsters. That world looked like some kind of game, along with monsters and adventurers, like a fantasy hit. Jin himself was squealing so fiercely as if his life depended on it, and that was basically how it was. The guy was giving his all. In the end, he still managed to become a max-level necromancer and became the king of this world. The guy had everything. But then, after meeting with the spatial administrator, Jin returned home to his world where everything was familiar. The guy did it just to reunite with his family he hadn't seen in years. He just wanted ordinary human happiness, but the Earth Jin came to had changed beyond recognition. The next day, Jean was already sitting on the bench and looking at his new phone. Well, at least there are means of communication. One thing the guy couldn't get out of his head was that he was called Awakened back then. He understood perfectly well that he was something special, because looking at the face of that very guard, one could understand that he was very scared. The man then asked Jean why the civilian had come here. He could have gone to the next world. There are no bloodstones. Then Jean was asked to sign a piece of paper and mark his presence. Then the guy didn't understand anything. All the time, Jin was thinking about how to earn money. He had to live on something and help his family after all. That's why he came back. Walking down the street, Jin sent a text to his mother about staying with a guy while let it be. It was embarrassing to be constantly imposing on Jin. Firmly decided to repay this kid. Min left him his number on a piece of paper. But dialing the listed number, Jin heard only the Job Search Employment Agency. He started to look at the phone and the paper, thinking he had been tricked again. Jin put the phone to his ear and asked, "Isn't that Jae-min's?" surprised voice on the other side replied negatively. Eventually, Jin realized he'd just been duped. He turned off the phone and prepared to smash it into the ground. Min himself was in school thinking about how to thank the strange man who saved him, because now the bullies will not even come near him. Dialing the number on the elevator, student thought about the need to meet him and talk to him, because it seems that this guy is a psycho, but not bad. The student had already entered his lonely apartment, but there was a little surprise waiting for him. Jin was already inside. For a few seconds, Min was in a stupor and rolled his eyes, trying to figure out how this psycho had gotten into his house. Jin himself sat quietly at the table and ate some cookies. Min shrieked at how he had gotten here in the first place. In a calm voice, Jin replied that he had just memorized the password, but that's like trespassing on private property. Hearing that Jin had already called the number, the student was visibly embarrassed, as if his plans had been discovered. Somehow, Jin looked as friendly as possible. He smiled and said he wanted to hear the answer to a few questions. Hearing that in front of him sits in the awakened Min could not believe his ears. He approached the strange acquaintance and shouted. Though not surprisingly, such a force, remembering how Jin scattered the bullies, everything was still in place. However, Jin was only interested in one thing. How much do awakened earn? He continued to crunch his chips and listen carefully. Surprised to the core, Min said that it depends on the dungeon. They have different ranks. The student began to tell, you go to the guild in various raids. At this rate, you can earn good money, can still get a job in the association. Jin didn't stop, but it is much more profitable to clear the dungeons alone, and the revenue is more student in the head, so it is. But it's too dangerous. The best thing to do is join a guild and pair up with someone else. You'll save your life. Wagging his finger, Jin said he didn't have time to go through various tests and confirm his qualifications. He needed money. Sighing heavily, Min lowered his eyes. Let him at least form a group in the dungeons alone is too dangerous to live. Right, he has a phone. The student showed the screen and said, download this app. Jin was very surprised what it was. Seeing which phone of his new acquaintance, Min sighed. Such an ancient, does anyone else use it? Jin mused. Hearing that it was a very old model, Jin frowned visibly. He had bought it like new after all. The guy remembered how a brazen phone salesman sold him this thing for a lot of money, saying it was the most popular model. Eventually, after many attempts, the student still installed the app and showed him the dungeon form here you can choose. But first, you need to measure your awakened level to be allowed to go on raids. Jin was very surprised to learn that you also need to pay for entry. Yes, for low-level dungeons, you have to pay about 10,000. Seeing the puzzled face of his new acquaintance, the student tensed up. Could he be up to something again? After a brief pause, Jin looked at him with a serious look and asked to borrow money again. The next day, he went to the Awakened Control Bureau to finally find out his level and do something. All the examiners in the Awakened room were horrified when they saw the dark aura around Jin. The guy stood before them covered in dark energy. He was truly menacing and ready to show off all his talents. In front of him lay the carcass of a rabbit he'd asked him to bring for the experiment because he had to conscript his army somehow. Holding out his hand, the Awakened One ordered his new warrior to rise immediately. The rabbit began to transform from it, began to ooze something black and very viscous, and soon the skeleton appeared in front of the others. The examiners came in. Horror, they did not know what to say, or stared wide-eyed at what was happening. Eventually, a new skeleton warrior appeared beside Jin Ohm. He stood holding a sharp blade and crunching his bones. With a trembling voice, one of the examiners still began to speak, comes out in front of them, Necromancer. Well, it turns out so. The man adjusted his glasses and couldn't believe his eyes. He had worked here quite a lot, but this was the first time I had seen such a thing. The abilities of the Awakened are gauged by the power level of their familiars, appeared Goblin as an opponent. Looking up, one could see a small projector that created holograms, simulating real opponents. That's pretty cool. Jin thought about it. Next to him stood his own skeleton and waited for the order to attack. With a wave of his hand, the Necromancer ordered his surname to immediately attack. A crackling sound was heard. The skeleton moved with great speed at the hologram monster's eyes lit up, as if there were two lights. After waiting for a few minutes, Jin still got his card. He had the lowest F rank possible. Guy. At first, he didn't understand what was going on, but the examiner explained that he was at the bottom of the list. On the other hand, Jin didn't really care who needed the ranks and stuff. Now he could enter the dungeon. In the guy's hands was a card with his own picture on it and other characteristics, including age and rank. It was time to clear the first dungeon. Jin headed for one of the stations and was already standing, looking at the GPS navigator. Suddenly, the guy was pulled away by someone's haughty voice, suggesting he join the group. After all, it would be so much easier. In front of my eyes stood several people, most importantly, with green hair, so there's a place to be found. However, Jin wasn't going to look for a group of his own. He waved it off and thanked them, saying he could handle it on his own. However, the Seekers were not going to give up so easily. Why should he have so much money to enter? You cannot carry a lot of crystals because of the time limit. Jin looked at him with surprised eyes coming out. He had only recently become a miner. The man laughed. The guy walked up to Jin and asked him what his rank was, and he answered for a second, and there was a tense pause between them. The man with green hair was named Pei Do-Su. He had rank E and was an experienced miner and guaranteed safety. The situation was complicated by the fact that the fee is divided for each member of the group. Singles, it will cost almost $1 million. Su began to explain that in order to go in alone, you have to pay for 8 people at once, so it is more profitable to hunt in a group. Jin wondered if he wanted to get information about this dungeon, then hunting in a group wasn't such a bad idea after all. He finally agreed. The guy standing next to him sighed heavily and turned to Jin. You? He was a little worried before the first entrance. This man's name was Hong Sung-gu. He was also ranked F, and it was obvious that the kid was worried too much. He was going down into the dungeon for the first time. This person was still a high school student. He was recruited a couple months ago. Hong started earning money as an Awakened. Suddenly, everyone turned around. A group of Seekers came out of the dungeon, holding their comrade under their arms. There was something serious happening. People were talking among themselves. One of them said that there is a hobgoblin. There is very dangerous, and to go down there is not an option. Su looked at them from top to bottom. There's no point in complaining. Just wasting time. It's better to go straight there and deal with everything. Su began to explain this goblin. This 2-star monster is quite dangerous, but can be handled if you are careful and together. Entering the dungeon, the first thing they saw was a trinity of goblins armed with blades. Hong immediately used his fireball. It was the guy's main ability to throw fireballs. After flying a few meters, the fireball crashed directly into the monsters and turned them into a handful of ashes in a second. Next, the squad leader came into force. He put his hand forward and used burning to burn these monsters. The goblins immediately received a powerful damage. They were clutching their heads. Their eyes were literally burning with fire. The rest of the squad fired their bows and one swordsman rushed forward swinging his blade. It was enough for him to split two goblins at once into two pieces with the purple liquid appearing outside. The skeleton summoned by the necromancer also entered the battle. He swung his blade and destroyed one goblin. Soon, there was no trace of the monsters. The skeleton turned out to be faster than thought, quite a useful thing considering that it can be fought at a distance. Jin looked at them from the side he had spent the remaining points to raise the skill level. Maybe it was, and worth it. It was time to collect the loot. Sue pulled out magic stones from the bodies of defeated enemies. Quite a good catch. The guy smiled. After learning the price of the small mana crystal, Jin was very surprised. Then no wonder, why do hunters earn so much? They're just at the beginning, and they've already collected a whole bag of blood crystals, and the little dungeons aren't even close. The squad leader looked with bloodshot eyes at his prey, a very good catch. Advancing a few more meters into the depths, the group immediately saw two goblins. Among them was the biggest Hob, the goblin, a huge monster, with a staff in his hands, the leader of all the others. Seeing his commander's eagerness to get into the fight, Jin suggested that it might be best to be a little more cautious. However, the commander confidently said that he had learned everything he needed to learn the main attack of this monster's magic attack was not worth worrying about. The ability of one of them, John Chula, is magical barriers. If you can block the first attack and then deal with the monster is not difficult. Jin sighed. Well, if the commander said so, then there is no need to obstruct, let him act as he knows how. The huge goblin squinted. His eyes glittered with yellow light, and the monster prepared to attack as easy prey. John immediately put up a magic barrier, needing to immediately block the attack and then counterattack. A huge electric wave crashed into the barrier. Unhappy, John felt an incredible pressure. Goblin was much stronger. But it all worked. The commander ordered to move forward immediately, need to attack, while the monster recharges. A fire appeared in the goblin's eyes. It's burning action. The monster waved his arms in an attempt to fight off the flames. The swordsman moved forward, swinging his blade, but the monster blocked the attack with his staff in time. Hong swung around and launched a fireball directly at the monster. This was his chance to destroy the monster. Jin was standing on the side watching the whole time. It looked pretty dangerous, but these guys are complicated. Compared to normal goblins, this one has intelligence and is even capable of creating spells. John continued to block. But the real danger is not the magic of this beast. The goblin was already preparing for the next throw. His eyes were burning. His small minions appeared nearby, armed with whatever they had in their hands. Some had a cot in their hands, and some had some other metal object. The whole group freaked out. These guys became different. They learn and adapt to the situation and use improvised means. One of the goblins constructed a windpipe and launched a throwing dart directly at one of the team members. The poison needle went straight into the unfortunate guy's neck, and I immediately began to sprout blood. The body of the unfortunate fighter was immediately paralyzed by the poison. He could not move a finger, and breathing became more difficult with each passing second. A second later, John felt a blow to the back of his head. Someone hit him with something heavy. The guy immediately blacked out. The little goblin did his thing, and with a laugh, headed back into the darkness. The archer tried to draw an arrow to hit the monster. Jin snapped his teeth. This was what he had feared. The goblins were learning and adapting. Now it would be more dangerous to fight them. Yes, and besides, their leader's main weapon is the ability to lead with his intellect to control his minions. Speaking of which, the little goblins, armed with improvised means, ran forward like a well-coordinated army under the guidance of their leader. Seeing this, the frightened Sue shouted that they should immediately retreat in front of the guy's eyes. Was panic. They had to get out of here, or they would be finished. The whole team was still trying to fight off the monsters. Some were using magic spells and the rest were running away. The commander said they couldn't handle it. They had to pull back now if they wanted to stay alive. But what about John? Their comrade was on the other side of the world. He fell in battle, but had to retreat. The whole team moved towards the exit of the dungeon. The huge goblin smiled as he looked at his victims with burning yellow eyes and prepared for the next attack. These people would not get away. The goblin began to build up energy throughout his body. He became covered in electrical discharges and channeled it all into his wand. Swinging the huge monster, sent a huge energy wave forward, ordering his wards to immediately attack. One of the fighters received a discharge of electricity right in his back. He sighed heavily and almost lost consciousness. Ignoring the fallen fighter, Sue moved forward and ordered everyone else to leave and not to look back. Meanwhile, Jin was hiding around the corner and watching everything from the sidelines with a smile on his face. The guy was getting ready. It had certainly been a long time since he had hunted goblins armed with his tire iron. Jin approached right into the goblin pack. Behind his back were already several skeletons lined up in rows. With the help of these guys, Jin can deal with monsters. The chief goblin, seeing the danger, ordered his army to attack this kid immediately, pointing his finger. With a tiered shout, Banzai Jin rushed straight at the main goblin. He swung his weapon like a knight. The goblins moved forward without fear. On their ghastly faces were wide smiles. The monsters were already anticipating the bounty. While the skeletons fought the rest of the smaller goblins, Jin decided to attack the main monster, raised his face up. After flying a few meters, the guy stuck his tire iron into the face of the huge monster, and a crunch was heard. The level was raised, Jin all lit up from the overabundance of energy. Now he is level 6. He has extra skill points. When he looked at his hands, he was glad to do everything by himself, much more convenient than with a group of people who can move as you want. But suddenly Jin turned his head. There in the distance was a guy lying unconscious. It was Hong, who had been abandoned here, fleeing from the monsters. Newsflash, he's alive. Hong was begging for help. He was on the verge of death and was about to go to the end of his life. Squatting down, Jin asked if he would save him what would be in it for him. Hong said that he would not tell anyone that there was a D-ranked fighter in front of him. Getting angry, Jin seemed like he didn't care. He didn't want that at all, than what he needed after all. Showing 2 fingers in front of him, Jin smiled and said he thought 2 would be enough, but the poor kid didn't understand what he needed. Finally, not finished. Hong was already holding a full backpack full of red stones at his chest, quite a heavy burden. Jin asked if he had collected everything. The boy nodded his head as the bodies of the defeated goblins lay nearby. Looking at this strange stranger, Hong pondered what level this man really was. He could easily hunt 2-star monsters. Plus, summons skeletons as a necromancer and discovers bloodstones, who he is after all. He also healed Hong by sucking the energy from the body of the defeated goblin. And considering everything, he should be C rank no less. The kid pondered this. If this person registered just a few hours ago, then this is an incredible result. Looking at all his belongings, Jin was glad he was going to get almost $1 million for all this, although he had paid $100,000. Pointing his finger at his goods, Jin said in a menacing voice that it all belonged to him, clear or not. Hong, shivering, agreed with a shaky voice. What scared him the most was that this guy was obsessed with money. Finally, they decided to go, but suddenly, Jin put his hand forward, blocking the way, showing that something was amiss here. He tensed up and said there was an ambush here. Someone was following them ahead. There were several silhouettes ahead. At least Jin could feel it. There were no more monsters here, so it was humans. The guys stopped by the escalator and took a closer look. Jin spotted them once and ordered them to come out, instead of hiding like rats. A few people twitched, standing up. It was worth guessing that this was their past team, and the leader was among them, glancing apprehensively at the 2 boys. In the end, they came down and looked at the defeated monsters with astonished eyes. Could it be that these 2 guys had slaughtered everyone? Jin replied that these monsters attacked when they got closer, and now, what are we going to do? He looked at everyone with a serious look and thought, we really need to get out of here. Looking at his team, the guy asked, they first ran away and now have the nerve to show up so shamelessly. It would be worth waiting near the barrier. Why did you show up here? Jin couldn't stop smiling and looked at them. The team leader smiled nervously. What's wrong with him? They are part of the team. So what are the complaints? The man started to make excuses and said that they went down to sweep the rest of the dungeon, but there were no monsters like Vitamoto. Jin realized once that these guys wouldn't back down so easily. Stop talking to him like that. Did you want rocks? And then Jin did the most unexpected thing. He opened his backpack and dumped all the bloody gems right on the floor, let them collect. The guy's eyes lit up with the voice of a predator. He said that if these people wanted, they could try to take the crystals. Sue smiled and said that their team wasn't stupid enough to attack Jin, who had single-handedly dealt with all the monsters. On the other hand, what did he expect at stake was the life of the whole team. The leader smiled. Now he could take the body of his comrade. Looking at the slippery type, Jin thought that maybe he had overreacted by mistaking the ambush for common vagrants. The guy exhaled heavily and took hold of his head. He had become too nervous in recent years and overly cautious. But when he hesitated a moment, Jin's eyes lit up with a bright flame of incandescence. Naturally, Sue was not going to retreat so easily. He ordered his minions to immediately attack and destroy these 2. Immediately, some powerful projectile flew into Hongai's chest. Staggered, it was arrow. Jin was still trying to deal with the fire. The ringleader laughed. Just don't let them hold a grudge. It's just business, nothing more. But no sooner had he finished his sentence than Jin came dangerously close to them and there was a pop. Outside, everything was relatively quiet. Another group of seekers were coming out of the dungeon. They were well equipped in powerful armor. The guys thanked their leader. It was a good job. Everybody got what they wanted. The leader turned out to be the same Yunhee girl. She picked up the phone, and the person on the other end said they had found the intruder. The information was confirmed as soon as the woman found out that Jin had registered as an awakened. She shrieked in surprise. Meanwhile, Su tried to deal with the newcomer. He realized that he was stronger than him and wanted to deal with his opponent in one blow. Jin smiled at this kid's boldness. So be it. The ringleader had a small blade in his hands, which he intended to stab his opponent with, but Jin reacted in time. What followed was a powerful throw in one fell swoop. Jin threw his opponent over himself and slammed him into the wall. The unfortunate man didn't even realize what had happened and already felt a powerful pain in his back, instantly losing consciousness. Jin, in turn, laughed seriously. Well, why? So banal, everything happened exactly as he thought it could, at least somehow more original. Pointing at the rest of the frightened crew members, Jin asked, "Are all the awakened ones as mean and brazen as these? Shameless traitors who abandon their friends and do not hesitate to destroy their own kind? Well then, it all makes sense." It was time for punishment. Swinging his arm, the necromancer ordered his army of skeletons to attack immediately. With a crash, the monsters moved forward. The skeletons turned out to be much stronger than ordinary people and immediately killed the hapless searchers. The gang leader was about to reach for his blade to defend himself, but he saw Jin slowly approaching him. Coughing up blood, Su wanted to talk. He put his hand forward, hoping his opponent would stop, but it didn't help. Jin grinned like a mad. What other talk, the guy was holding a small blade. It was only a couple of seconds before the blade was in the chest of the unfortunate man, who screamed in fear and pain, but could do nothing. While Jin was trying to find some money from this weasel, Hong was holding his shoulder with an arrow sticking out of it, trying to regain consciousness. Hong was frightened. Not only was he about to be sent to the next world, but this necromancer had gone on a rampage that was hard to believe. Meanwhile, Jin examined the body of his defeated foe in an attempt to find anything useful, but it was all empty. Eventually, the necromancer turned to his comrade and asked why this one was silent. He didn't like something. Hong, who forgot how to speak out of fear, just looked at his savior with round eyes. Rising to his feet, Jin said in a guilty voice that this kid was in danger because of him. When the necromancer refused, he said that Hong would then pay double the amount. Leaning toward him and making a scary face, Jin said it was because he had saved him twice. Upstairs, things went on as usual, with people going in and out of the dungeon in an attempt to find anything of value. There was, and Jin about his new acquaintance. Everyone else turns out to be outgunned by the monsters. Only these two returned. The administrator looked at them incredulously. Then how did they manage to collect all those stones? Looking at his heavy backpack behind his back, Jin said it was a sin to leave such a good thing lying just on the ground, so they packed up. The receptionist held out a small notepad and asked them to sign. Perhaps they would be contacted by the bureau to clarify the situation. The guys were already out of the dungeon and heading for their homes. Jin couldn't believe he'd gotten a fortune for one raid. It's much more profitable than going with a useless group. Hong, in turn, was not so happy. Even with the money he had saved up, it wouldn't be enough to pay it off. Maybe it would be better to drop the price, or at least ask for it. Suddenly, the boy heard Jin's voice addressing him by name. He raised his eyes and looked fearfully before him. Looking at him, the necromancer smiled and said that he really doesn't like people who attack from the back. Let him keep that in mind. With a wave of his hand, Jin went about his business, saying he was waiting for a call. His companion sighed heavily and said he would have to take out a loan. But it's only now that he's realized how much money is behind him. 400 million is crazy money. Meanwhile, the salesman at the electronics store was yawning and almost falling asleep on the job, trying to amuse himself somehow. There were no customers today. The store was empty, and all that was left to do was sit behind the counter and be bored. Suddenly, there was a rumbling sound. The fat man shuddered in surprise and froze in place. He opened the door with his foot and approached with wide strides. I didn't expect this man to be so bold. Jin lifted him off the ground. A second later, the salesman received a powerful slap. The handprint was left on his chub. The man wanted to shout and call for help, at least to be heard, otherwise he would be sent to the grave. But Jin continued to slap the unfortunate fat man. Claps were heard, and the salesman's head flew forward. The salesman had already realized he was finished. In front of him, some really crazy nutcase. Jin kept holding him by the scruff of the neck. The unfortunate salesman was already begging for mercy. His cheeks were beginning to turn purple from the endless blows. Eventually, Jin got tired of playing these games and threw the fat man to the ground. The salesman collapsed and groaned. Then Jin looked at him. The salesman kneeled down like an obedient slave and bowed. The necromancer repeated his phrase, "He really dislikes people who stab you in the back and those who cheat." The salesman didn't understand what kind of backstabbing, what kind of deceit. He'd never seen him before in his life. What's that got to do with it? Taking his old cell phone out of his pocket, Jin held it up to the face of the uncomprehending salesman. "He sold it this morning, right?" "Yeah, it was the same old phone with the shiny screen he sold to some sucker this morning." So this dude shows up at the store to get revenge. Yeah, the clerk remembered that happening. Even back then, Jin had seemed very strange to him, so surprised at how much technology had advanced in recent years. And now the very man in the tracksuit stood in front of him holding the phone in his hands and with crazed eyes, eager for revenge. As expected, eventually Jin got his brand new red phone. It was a different color and completely glitch-free. Walking out of the store, Jin continued to curse the unfortunate salesman, but now everything was normal. The joy didn't last long. Suddenly Jin heard someone call his name and turned his head around. Several plainclothesmen approached him from either side and started the conversation first. Among them was this very woman named Yoon-hee along with her underlings. She fluttered her hands around to see if this guy was too fearless for a rookie. Jin had the least desire to get involved with her and looked at her with surprised eyes. Who the hell is this? The woman didn't say a word, but only smiled as she looked at her new victim, like a predator. After introducing herself, the girl named her title and the group she belonged to. She stuck her hands in her pockets and looked at the stranger. There was a brief pause between them as they glared at each other, waiting for someone to do something. The detection skill shows that this lady is quite strong. She was literally emanating a threatening aura of red color. Trying to guard Jin's peace of mind, asked what she wanted from him. She pestered. Smiling, Yoon-hee said in a sneaky voice that it was just one rat fumbling around their guild's dungeons. Jin didn't like it when someone called him names like that. He had a crazy smile on his face and realized that there was no way to do it without a fight. Okay, if he's a rat, then why are there so many people here and really he's literally surrounded on both sides? He kept laughing that, well, her guild is pretty strong and the dungeons were so cheesy it was just ridiculous. But no sooner had Jin finished his sentence than a hand flew into his face and caught him, knocking him to the ground. Next came a cracking sound as one of the group hit Jin right in the ground and it flew out from under him. The red-haired man told Jin to better watch his words for a rat like him to judge their guild. Jin couldn't stand to be attacked in the middle of nowhere. What did he do? He was just cleaning up a dungeon. Eventually, the guy jumped to his feet and grabbed the arm of his attacker. The man didn't even realize what had happened. Yoon-hee literally grew out of the ground, the woman swung around and with one powerful blow threw Jin back many meters. The unfortunate man couldn't stand on his feet and flew across the ground. It was quite painful. His whole body ached, as if a car had hit you. However, the woman wasn't even going to retreat. She jumped up to Jinwoo and swung her foot, aiming straight at his head. The exhausted guy couldn't react in time, and the blow went straight to his jaw. It hurt, but he survived. The henchmen had already begun to gather around their leader and surrounded Jin even tighter. Yoon-hee allowed myself to give him a piece of advice. He is naturally ranked higher than shown on the chart, but donned to let him be arrogant. Eventually, they got behind poor Jin and told him to remember their words, if you want to live longer. Jin was still lying on the road, barely breathing. He hadn't been punched in the face like that in a long time. I'd better look at them. When he returned to his comrade Min's room, he was shocked to find out who Jin had run into on the way here. On the guy's literal face was gone. The necromancer inquired, did they know anything? The student nodded, of course, one of the most famous fighters. This guild has a huge influence in the politics and economy of the whole country, in short, very important people. Hearing that he was being told off like a little kid, Jin became angry, and he could defeat at least a dozen of these guilds when he regained his strength. Min laughed. Such ego is amazing. Jin continued to grit his teeth. Yes, how can he even know who he is talking to? Certainly the guy himself was sure that he was the strongest here. The potential of a necromancer is simply limitless if you unlock the powers. Anyway, it was time to return the favor. Jin handed the guy a bag of some stuff. There was some perfume. The student didn't understand why he needed it, but Jin also held out the money he'd borrowed. There was considerably more than Min had given him initially, and the guy immediately started to refuse, but Jin insisted. It was only now that Min finally realized that this strange guy named Jin, not so bad strange of course, but definitely not bad. Jin smiled and said that the rest was the rent. Min didn't immediately understand what he was talking about, but he agreed. It came to him after a second, in the sense of housing fees, how to understand it. For several minutes, Min looked at the bill and did not understand anything. That weird bum is going to continue living here. Jin continued to drink. The students asked, but didn't Jin meet his mother? The necromancer replied that it's too small a house. He doesn't want to embarrass anyone. What's actually wrong there? Jin looked closely. Too little. Does it really need more money? But the student shook his head. He was about to say something else, but suddenly he saw a new phone lying on the table. Besides, the latest model is the coolest. Holding out his hand, Min asked for a little look. He was curious himself. Jin held out his phone. Insanely expensive phone. Where did Jin manage to earn so well? The necromancer replied that he simply obtained it as a result of a single event. He was really cool for a second. The necromancer stopped and looked in front of him as if something was bothering him. Min suddenly saw the amount of money that the strange new acquaintance had gotten for one raid. Jin demanded to hand over the phone immediately. Jin himself was surprised at the 40 million he had received on his phone. The sender was Hong. Necromancer shuddered. He had said 4 million. In the end, Jin decided to meet his comrade and clarify the situation. Hong was already approaching him with a leisurely gait. Holding out the phone to him, Necromancer asked what it was in general and how to understand why he sent him so much money. Seeing that his comrade was not joking, Hong threw himself on his knees and began to apologize. He realized what Jin could do to him. The guy begged for time. He will definitely give the next part, just he needs a little more. People are already starting to look at them askew, some thug who's swindling money out of a poor kid. Jin was starting to get annoyed by this. He ordered him to sit down immediately. He just wanted to have a normal conversation. The frightened boy pleaded that he would give everything, but he needed a little more time to raise the necessary amount of money. Hearing about the 400 million, Jin even wondered a little what this kid was talking about. He had lost his mind. Hong continued to look at him with frightened eyes and nodded. Yes, of course. Exactly how much will he give everything? Jin finally got it. That kid got it all wrong. He thought he was talking about $4 million. Well, if he was wrong, then he deserves it. Jin looked at his comrade, who was still scared, looked at him. Folding his hands in front of him, the necromancer smiled and asked in a good-natured voice how long he had to wait in that case. The next day, I changed my clothes and decided to take a walk in the local park, and I had to meet someone. There already waited for him, Han. He waved his hand, urging his friend to come closer. Guy, already in cars. Once seated in the car, Necromancer asked why he was so happy. Han, all of you driving, asked, wasn't it possible to be happy or what? At the end of the conversation, Jin decided to banter a bit well. If Hong can't get that amount of money, then we'll be in his group and give a portion of the profits. But even then, the Necromancer didn't rest easy. This way, the kid would just stick to him conveniently, of course, thought of it. The frightened student waved his hands all wrong. In fact, if the Necromancer wanted to, then Hong could be his personal manager, and that was interesting. Yes, exactly. So? The boy confirmed he would search for a suitable dungeon, even driving his master to them. When he heard that he was now a servant, the unfortunate man was petrified inside himself in a way no one had ever called him before. Jean looked at him and said that if he didn't have enough money, who decided to just pay him back. Hong clapped his hands in resentment. It was true that there was no way out, but he wanted to live. Okay, in that case, Jean said he's willing to give him a year for free would be too hard, so he'll have a share. Hearing what good fortune had befallen him, Hong grasped his master's hand and began to thank him for such kindness. And now Jin was sitting in the car and thinking he just wanted to return the extra, but he got himself a servant. The Necromancer said that if the kid would do his job well, 10% of the profits would belong to him. Such conditions would be fair. The joyful Hong almost cried, but Jin interrupted him to see if the boy had found the dungeon they were talking about. Yes, it was done. It was in one of the stations in that dungeon. There's a rocky creature that looks like a big cockroach. And so the guys were in place. Jean looked at the scene. Yes, indeed, there were a lot of monsters here. These creeping monsters were literally surrounding them. The Necromancer ordered his friend to keep his eyes open. The boy shakily agreed. Having to spend all his skills and control, Jean opened the notification window, started tapping on the screen. If there are many of them, there will be many of us. After a second on the floor was an army of skeletons. They were enough to destroy all this undead at once, only need to try hard. These monsters were huge beetles with massive claws around their mouths. They looked like cockroaches. One of the monsters was already surrounded by 3 skeletons and waving their blades. At this rate, dealing with them would be very easy. While the Necromancer was dealing with the rest of the monsters, Hong had already managed to collect all the bloodstones that were upstairs and was heading back. After praising him for his work, Jin waved his hand. Hong saw that there were no more monsters left here. Normally, a raid like this takes a couple hours, but this guy did it in about 15 minutes. Who the hell is he? Eventually, from the endless number of these monsters, even the Necromancer grew tired and sat down on a bench to rest. He's level 7 now. Yeah, and a lot of achievement points have come up to spread out the skills. So far, there was nothing worthwhile, but suddenly, the guy saw something interesting and looked closely. There was the summoning of a skeleton mage. After all, his comrade had already gathered everything and found even the return stone. Only less than half an hour had passed. Jean wondered at the entrance he'd paid for 4 hours, and they had 3.5 more to do in the meantime. After calculating everything in his mind, Necromancer said that they still have 7 more times to go, so let the kid get ready. The student sighed. When it was finally over, Hong was already standing at the front desk. He was told that 53 million won had been accrued. For a few seconds, the guy stood there in a daze, as if he was stunned, trying to understand what had happened. Hearing such a fabulous amount of money, Hong almost fainted. He had earned a fortune in one raid. He made more in one day than he did in 6 months of hard work. It's just an incredible gold mine. Necromancer Hong appeared nearby, still not taking his eyes off his trembling voice, said that it was simply awesome. Folding his hands in front of him as if about to pray, Hong said that his older brother was simply a great man. Jin only smiled and let the kid take it easy. There were still 7 approaches left, so let him get ready for the job. And so the two friends moved back to the dungeon. Hong kept thinking that it was the gods who had sent him such a gift for his efforts. There was almost no one in the office. Only one employee was sitting at his computer and was about to make coffee. Whistling a tune to himself, he ground coffee, the aroma of fresh beans spreading throughout the room. Suddenly, he received a call on his service phone. A man introduced himself. On the other side was a man named Gay Min. A support agent heard that this morning 2 guys bought a ticket for a few hours and still haven't gotten out of the dungeon. They're alive. The necromancer was just coming out of the dungeon along with his friend, and they were already being closely watched because of their results. The support agent overheard someone on the other end of the line already betting on what these guys were up to. Next to him sat 2 more colleagues. They were talking among themselves. In any case, we need to find information about these guys immediately. Hearing that the legendary player was the lowest ranked support agent, couldn't believe his eyes. He sat down at the computer monitor and began to search diligently for information. He needed to know something about this strange man. That same Gene just registered yesterday and his associate just a couple months ago. How did they get so successful in such a short period of time? 2 rookies clearing out a 3-star dungeon in a few minutes is mind-boggling who they are. Finally, the agent threw on his jacket and headed for the exit. It had certainly been a long time since he'd seen such promising newcomers. While Jin and his new friend were cleaning up, they were already being closely followed from several directions. The same guild girl was sitting in her office watching the TV. These 2 were bothering her eyes. She kept her eyes on Jin. The lowest level necromancer reaches such heights. It's simply unfathomable. A subordinate sat nearby. He asked the captain what she thought of the man. Yunhee began to think back. Of course, she thought that this kid was extraordinary, but to be so unbelievable. That's at least a C rank at least. How did he get that far? The man folded his arms in front of him. There are only 2 options. Either he's hiding his abilities, or he's pumping at an incredible rate. I wonder if there's even a single person with the same ability overnight. He rose 2 or even 3 ranks higher. There was one such incident many years ago. This is one day, this person from the lowest got to the rank of A, until he became number 1 in Korea. This guild master Lee Sang-ho was sitting in front of us, and he demanded that we bring this person to him immediately to find out everything about him. Interesting specimen. And so they went to the dungeon again. Hong was already picking at something trying to get another bloodstone, and the catch was pretty good. The guy was breathing heavily, trying to get another bait out of the body of the defeated monster money. It's certainly very good, but at this rate, he'll go to the other side of the world faster than he'll pay it off for a long time. It's pretty hard worse than it looked at first glance. Eventually, the poor man ran out of breath and asked Jin for a bit at least to rest. The necromancers looked at him with a pleased look. Jin sighed and smirked. Did his companions have already exhausted themselves? They had only tasted nothing here after all. Eventually, the guys decided to take a break after all and sat down near the fence. They still had more than an hour to spare. Gene reflected he had already earned almost $500 million, enough to buy a house for his mother and sister. Finally, the necromancer stood up and turned to his comrade. Hong looked at him with surprised eyes. Jin said that all the remaining bloodstones the guy can take the necromancer will protect him. In case of anything, let him not worry. And now, why not speed up? Gene exhaled and started moving at such a staggering speed that his friend didn't even have time to realize anything. And now the guy was left alone with himself and the bodies of the defeated monsters. He did not even have time to say anything. Holding his nail gun in his hands, Jin ran forward, breaking through the crowds of monsters. He destroyed the beetles one by one. The skeletons helped him in this, and the guy kept running forward without noticing the obstacles. Suddenly, another huge bug appeared behind the necromancer's back. The monster was barring with its huge pincers. Jin reacted in time, and with one powerful blow, he split the monster's body in 2 and the shell crunched. "Well, that should be enough," said the necromancer, looking over the result of his work. Beside him stood his bone army. Another notification sign appeared in front of the boy, and he had to choose a class. In the world where he was, a class could be chosen after a dozen levels. Yes, and besides, he already had his own class of necromancer. The system itself began analyzing his abilities and assigning its own class. Jin was toying in his seat. Maybe this dual-class guy scratched his head. He chose the warrior class. This could be a problem. After all, he is already a necromancer. Yes, and besides, where to become a sorcerer was much more profitable because these characteristics overlapped with his key feature of a necromancer. Furthermore, Jin was even more surprised when he was given a weapon as a reward for upgrading. But it seemed to be just an ordinary rebar with nothing to do. Jin took his new weapon and raised the pipe upwards like a victorious warrior. And now Jin has received the Demon Seal Crystal, a special seal that necromancers receive when they reach certain levels. A total of 7 seals are available inside. There are unrivaled familiars, huge monsters that can serve as a good army. Jin ordered the seal to be opened. At the same second, a flash of red-colored lightning shone around. After the transformation was over, the necromancer opened his mouth in astonishment at what he saw that shocked him. In front of him stood a little girl with wings behind her back and yellow hair. Her name was Bibi. Jin already knew her before. Before the necromancer could even say a word, the girl threw herself around his neck and hugged him tightly, screaming that she missed her master very much. At the same time, the guy didn't understand anything about what had even happened. Didn't she stay in that world? With eyes full of tears, Bibi looked at her master. After Jin left the world, all the familiars were moved. The necromancer scratched his head. Wait a minute, did they move with him? Wait, what about the seal? Suddenly, the demon girl smelled some strange odor, sniffed, and turned around what it even smelled like. Hearing that Bibi could smell Tranet subjects from these creatures, Jin was horrified at what this even meant. Tranet! This demon invaded the world from some otherworldly dimension and destroyed most life on Earth. Jin had never fought him, but he was so sick of this demon's subjects that he was starting to get nauseous. And now this demon had decided to invade the land. Jean and Bebe stood looking at the bodies of the defeated insects. The necromancer thought he had escaped from this hell, but it turned out that hell was following him. On the surface, a man in business clothes had already met his master and waved his hand. He looked extremely tired. The man in the red jacket appeared in front of him. It was the manager. He asked where the 2 subordinates were. The subordinate said they came in less than 10 minutes ago. They should have been back soon. They're not so simple either. They earned almost 500 million won. The man was extremely worried. He was the first time he'd encountered something like this in his practice. He sighed heavily. With such strength, he could mop up the dungeons by himself, but unfortunately, there was no such thing. They came out, and Jin and Hong were talking to the instructor at the entrance to the dungeon. The manager immediately approached them. He greeted them and asked for a moment of time. Jin looked at him in disbelief. The manager looked at them kindly and held out his hand. He said it would only take a couple minutes. Don't put anything else to listen to. Jin turned away and said he was refusing. The manager rushed after him. With an annoyed look at the annoying man, asked if he was taking up time. Why ask? Realizing what type of person he was dealing with, the administrator apologized and turned cold. Then straight to the point, the man held out his business card and said that the Hammer Guild wished to recruit them into their ranks. Without listening to anything else, Jin grabbed his companion by the arm and dragged him away. He was not interested. The necromancer decided to show that he knew exactly who was in front of him. The Hammer Guild was one of the top 3 guilds in Korea. Continuing to hold out his business card, the manager said that if this person joined their guild, he would have full support. Suddenly, Jin addressed him in the most impolite way possible. The administrator went cold. Looking at him like a psychopath, Jin said he wasn't in the mood for this right now, so let him go if he wanted to live. That same day, Jin's mother was in complete shock. She looked in front of her and didn't know what to say. In front of them stood a huge mansion realtor, offered the best conditions. The sister of the protagonist was already running on the lawn. The mother looked at her son and asked, "Is he really going to buy such an expensive house?" The woman could not believe her eyes. The necromancer showed his phone and said he had recently topped up his account. The woman hiccuped in surprise at the incredible amount of money there. To be honest, Sun decided to admit that he was actually awakened. The woman couldn't believe her ears, so he earned it in the dungeons. Isn't it dangerous? Since he's been missing, his mother didn't want to bring it up, but she had to. Spreading his arms, Jin said that it wasn't as hard as it seemed, all the same as catching beetles, no need to worry. But the woman did not relent. Even so, it is too dangerous. Sun should not expose himself to such a risk. Su A asked to get a dog. The girl was delighted. The small child dragged his mother by the edge of her shirt and looked at her with pleading eyes, but the woman was busy. Jin leaned over to his little sister and stroked her head. It's compensation for hard times. Let them just believe in him. They stood like that on the lawn. Mother couldn't believe what was happening. But it wasn't a dream. It was all real life. Night came and Jin decided to meet his assistant. He called Bebe into the real world. A few seconds passed, but the demoness did not appear. Necromancer was already beginning to lose patience. Let her come out immediately. Suddenly, in front of the guy appeared a strange cat, ordinary stray black cat. She what turned or what? Taking the cat in her arms, Jin examined her Bibe meowed and said she was having trouble accepting her true form. So she can only take her form in dungeons, I see. But why a cat? Then what about the energy? Maybe she senses something, but the cat said it was quiet. Necromancer took a closer look. Perhaps Jin would have continued to stare at the cat if he hadn't been distracted by a familiar voice. Sang-ho stood in front of him and greeted his new acquaintance. He was called the Guild Boss. Jin met with his slave. Hong shook his head and said that he still couldn't understand his master's intention. The guy was driving and turned around to his boss, addressing him by his first name. He wanted to ask something. Why is it that Jin rejected the offer from the guild? Maybe there is some reason. The necromancer sat next to him and remained silent. These questions were starting to get to him. Jin answered simply because he didn't feel like talking about it right now. But still, he said that he just didn't like doing someone else's errands. Hong rejoiced as even all-powerful guilds couldn't compare to him. He was very happy because he was lucky to meet such a person who made him rich. But still, the guy couldn't understand why this man refused such favorable terms. Jin just sat and watched. But that didn't matter now. Soon, Hong would be able to drive the car he'd been dreaming of for so long. All he has to do is trust his master and follow him, then everything will be fine. When they arrived at the car dealership, the kid waited a few minutes until the ubiquitous manager showed up. The man sat down across from the buyer and laid out a piece of paper with a contract to be signed. The joyful Hong said he would sign it immediately. His eyes were burning with anticipation. He would finally realize his dream. Meanwhile, Jin himself was meeting with Sang-ho, and they were sitting in a cafe. The master was asking about his current run-in with Yoon-hee. In his memory, he remembered that very insolent red-haired girl. If it was about her, then yes, she had really got on his nerves. Master said she was his sister, but she had an explosive temper. Jin sat across from him and watched. The man smiled. He said that this person was quite valuable to their guild, so he could offset any costs. The necromancer realized that this was not the reason why he had been summoned here. The guildmaster turned serious. Jin showed stunning results, completely out of character for his rank. Naturally, the man wanted to lure Jin into his guild. He wasn't even embarrassed. Okay, if we play it big, Jin asked if this guy would give him the head roll if he could beat him. Sang-ho laughed and said that he had heard of this confidence, which was to be expected. He said his rank is nothing compared to other players. He leads a guild not because he is strong. He wouldn't be able to give Jin Woo's seat to him even if he won. The necromancer looked at him with a surprised look, and there was definitely a catch. Not wanting to talk about this topic anymore, Jin got up from his seat and headed for the exit. He wasn't interested. But the master was not going to let him go so easily. He asked if the guy knew why the dungeons appeared in the first place. It's been a few years since the Great Underground Shakeout, and they still haven't learned anything about dungeons. But they are getting bigger, and the monsters in them are much stronger. But humanity is not frightened by it at all. They, on the contrary, benefit. The world will descend into chaos. If this continues, Jin has been standing in his place the whole time he's been interested. The master said that to gather the awakened and stop all this chaos was his task. The man was extremely serious, and so the master hopes that Jin En will entrust them with his power. Meanwhile, the necromancer stood without saying a word and reasoned. And now, in the Hammer Guild, there was an oppressive atmosphere as the workers sat in their seats, but they could literally feel the powerful energy. Their master was in a terrible mood. Since morning, he had literally been exuding anger and hatred. Suddenly, a co-worker shrieked that the very same guys had booked the 6th exit at the station. The manager stopped the mug a centimeter from his face. Why ruin his mood by talking about this guy since morning? But the thing was that this 4-star dungeon employee in a trembling voice said, "It master stopped." He choked on his tea and spit it all back into his mug. How does that even make sense? The man jumped up to the monitor. Could these two really have booked a dungeon of this level for 2, but everything was so master, couldn't believe his eyes. The man stared at the monitor. A player of this rank cannot enter a dungeon higher than 4 stars. It would be understandable if they went into mining or support. But what powers do these two possess? If going for such a risky operation, the man pondered. He looked at his colleague. They also have such a dungeon. Yes, at exit 11 near one of the stations. The leader immediately said to cancel all reservations for this dungeon. It seems he hadn't given up yet and wanted to get such a valuable player. But the man did not even think of stopping trying this time. These two will definitely fall into their trap. If you want to catch a fish, you need the right bait. Meanwhile, Jin and his subordinate were driving a brand new BMW on the highway. The car was running incredibly smoothly. Hong was all shiny with happiness. He said he bought this car to drive his boss around, but Jin didn't even know what it was called. The kid wondered how he could not know such a famous brand of cars. He was born in the forest, but Jin was just happy. Smiling Hong said he would do his best to make sure his boss rode in comfort. Jin only smiled. In the meantime, people were already piling up at the station, and they couldn't get in, but the clerk refused to let them in. The kid wouldn't give up. He begged them to let them in. They'll take full responsibility. It's just necessary. Hong had already lost all hope. He didn't know what to do. The clerk wasn't going to let them in under any pretext. The boy turned back and looked at Jean, who was leaning against the fence and waiting. Coming closer to the boss, the boy apologized and said he didn't want to be let in, that he needed to do a good recon first. Well, there's nothing you can do. Jean ogled, well, at least a 3-star dungeon needs to be found nearby to make money. Suddenly, they were distracted by a familiar voice and turned towards the man who was approaching them. Naturally, it was the head of the guild Hammer. He waved his hands and greeted the old acquaintances, asking, "Did something happen?" The man looked at them with enlightened eyes. His plan was about to come to fruition. Jin gritted his teeth in anger and realized that it was his doing, but it couldn't be helped. The necromancer decided to start the conversation first, and how this whippersnapper was going to help them would give them a pass. After a few minutes, the guild boss led them to his 4-star dungeon and indicated with his hand that they could pass through. But it was all too good to be true. Jin felt there was a catch. You've got to pay for it. There is. The head smiled. This is just a gesture of goodwill. He controls all the dungeons according to the levels, so let them mop up. Without arguing for long, Jin smiled. Well, if it's such a generous thing to do, he would be more than happy to clean up the dungeon. But that was not all. The master said that for them there is a small gift. So to say, welcoming president is what a surprise. The man waved his hands and immediately retreated somewhere else. He was smiling the whole time. Walking to his car, the boss opened the trunk and laughed. Of course, everything has to be paid for, and they will pay. The manager laughed like crazy. Of course, he didn't ask for anything in return, but a favor is usually answered with a favor. Naturally, this necromancer is not a simple awakened one. Now he's on the hook, and you can control him however you want. The dungeon guard laughed. Yesterday, Jin was completely different. The necromancer looked at him and wondered what else. Yesterday, he was too scared to even talk to him, and now Vaughn, the kind Jean, smiled. He was just in a bad mood. Yesterday, all my thoughts were on that very thing. Now we can talk, if that's what it's about. The guard was so pleased that he even offered a drink after a successful raid. Well, that sounds good, and the necromancer agreed. The employee laughed to himself. This brat doesn't even realize what kind of trap they've fallen into. Now they're hooked. This staff member had already been in the guild for a couple years, and today Jin would definitely sign the contract. Just need to get him drunk. They started talking, and the employee was very friendly and said he knew a good place to hang out. Hong watched it all with an indifferent expression. It's a waste of time. His boss will never agree. Here came the guild master. He was surprised when he saw no one in front of him. The station was empty. The officer said the two went into the dungeon and said nothing. He didn't even have time to apprehend them. The manager's hands shook as he held 2 large bags of gifts. The man came in a rage. A coworker asked, wasn't the man going to wait for them until the manager returned, slowly boiling over with rage about to explode. After seeing the survival kit, the employee was horrified. The master came out, wanted to help them. Such dungeons required a much higher rank than these two, and the master was well aware of that. With the strength that Jin had, he wouldn't have any trouble defeating the monsters in this dungeon at all. Starting with 4 and ending with 6-star dungeons, they are different from the low levels. Even a high-ranked player wouldn't come back from there alive. Without training, the master realized that these two were finished. Meanwhile, the guys were looking at everything around them. They had already handled the sweep and were looking for the return stone. But suddenly the necromancer said that there is no stone here. The helper wondered how to understand it, but how do they get out now? It was decided to look even better. Guys moved forward into the darkness of the dungeon no matter how scary it was. There's no stone to turn back. What the hell is going on here? All the way Jin thought about it. Suddenly turning his head somewhere to the side, Hong said that the entrance seemed to be that way. Jin stopped for a second and listened. And then the boy also heard a strange sound and saw a glow right in front of him. Everything began to vibrate. In front of the 2 travelers was a portal, a huge black hole, similar to the one from the space movies, but now it was here on Earth. So this thing is the reason the portal stone didn't show up. Well, we got to get in there. There's no other way. Jin smiled, and he had thought that everything was not clean here, so that's why there was no return stone. Well, there is no way out left to go through this. Whole guys moved forward. There was an interesting view waiting for them. This was another dimension. Unlike the real world, there were plants growing here, and it was like some big forest. Suddenly, Hong blushed with embarrassment, and closed up he was surprised and horrified to find himself completely naked. Jin's eyes almost popped out of his head when he looked at him. What's he doing? The guy stripped right there. But then it turned out that the necromancer himself was also naked. Jin examined his body and marveled. Okay, now I see. Only the bodies have moved. The equipment and even the clothes are still in the other world. And now the two of them are standing naked in the middle of some forest in the middle of nowhere. And there's this weird, scary sound. Now, it was like a 4-star dungeon. And after getting some clothes, the guys began to get their bearings. Hong glanced at his companion every now and then to see how much skill he had. Even here, he was acting completely calm. He seems to be able to control the space. Jin easily got some clothes and gave them to the boy. He immediately got dressed. But what's he doing now? Jin was toying with, looking at the notification window, something clicking there with his fingers. Jin is now at level 10, but thanks to the transferred skills, he is much higher than a normal player. But this dungeon is still dangerous. Where there were these ubiquitous cockroaches, the skills of a necromancer would have sufficed. But here it's different. He won't be able to fight face to face. There is no other way. You need to apply a special warrior skill. Immediately began to appear icons with notifications of new skills. The guys heard something coming. This something was very big and massive. It was ripping out the roots of trees and thumping its feet loudly. Suddenly, from the thicket of the forest appeared some creature that looked like a huge crocodile, but much larger than the usual amphibians. Taking out his weapon, Jin grabbed a stick that for some reason began to glow blue and prepared to attack. The guy moved forward and, jumping up in one place, flew high above the monster and swung his stick. So it was the warrior's intuition that the crocodile opened its wide, toothy maw. It was a level much higher than the necromancer himself and was preparing to devour him. Meanwhile, the guild leader and his subordinate were looking outside the barrier, where time passed much faster. The subordinate looked at the boss with frightened eyes to see if they would be able to handle the crocodile, which is quite a strong monster. The man looked at him and asked, "Are they really going to fight with their bare hands? They have a survival kit." Portals from other dimensions do not allow minerals to pass through, so you can only transfer things that you also mined in another dimension. Monsters are not the biggest problem man has taken on his head. The main trouble is the lack of food and water. One problem after another, the men were talking amongst themselves. These guys are unlikely to survive in there. But as it turned out, everything is not so bad. Our heroes have already managed to make a kebab from delicious crocodile meat. Taking a big bite, Hong started to smile. It was incredibly tasty. The boy was very pleased. Jean handed him a large glass of beer. Crocodile meat was always considered a delicacy. Let him try this. The kid took a few sips of the heady drink and blushed. It really was incredibly tasty. Looking at him with a good-natured gaze, Jin smiled after all. This kid wasn't as goofy as he had originally seemed, and the necromancer had even grown attached to him. Meanwhile, the guild leader sat and puzzled over whether or not the two of them would survive. They were going through all the options they could. The staff member looked at him and grimaced and uttered only one word: swamp. This was going to be quite a dangerous ordeal. They occasionally appear in the dungeon's viscous and very dangerous sentence for an inexperienced traveler. Meanwhile, the couple was already advancing through the swamp. Hong suddenly shrieked in surprise. Something was approaching them from above. The boy immediately looked up. There were many monkeys sitting on the branches, their eyes glowing like predators, and they didn't seem to be particularly friendly. Meanwhile, the two managers were sitting around thinking things were very complicated and bad. These two were unlikely to survive. Well, those two were all right. The monkeys ran in fear when fireballs flew at them like meteorites from the sky. Jin rejoiced to let his servants burn every last one of them and turn these monkeys to ashes. His comrade stood aside and couldn't believe his eyes. Could it be that the boss also possesses such a skill? Yes. Who the hell is he? Eventually, the guy finished with the monkeys. The skeletons had cleared everything out. Speaking of skeletons, an entire army of high-level monsters were already standing in front of their masters and ready to follow orders. It's been over 4 hours and the two still haven't shown up. The managers don't know what to think. It seems they're finished. Noodling on a stick, the boss said that not only monsters are the problem of the dungeon, there are also a lot of insects quite poisonous. The man asked his ward how much he thought these two knew about the dungeon ecosystem. Probably nothing. The deputy was terrified that if they ate something poisonous and got poisoned, they'd be dead. As if I could hear them talking, Hong pulled out some strange fruit that looked like a ball of fuzzy flesh, and I wanted to eat it. But Jin stopped the guy by saying that if you eat this fruit raw, you're done for. You can kiss your life goodbye. The guy, who had already taken a bite, started spitting it all out and clearing his mouth, but you couldn't tell before. Yes, and besides, I wonder how Jin knows all this, but the necromancer was in no hurry to tell all the secrets while it was still early. Meanwhile, the two managers sat there constantly, even when night fell. Why are they so eager to get Jean? The boss looked in front of him and smiled. Over the past few years, his eyes had never deceived him. Yes, and neither had his intuition. Subordinates smiled. Yes, the stories of how he recruited the very best still speak for themselves. But now, the boss thought that Jin, the one he saw today with his own eyes, was much cooler than the best players. If this guy says goodbye to his life, it will be a great loss to all mankind. The subordinate is even a little scared. But he immediately jumped up on the spot and offered to pray for the life of this fighter. May he return alive and unharmed. But it will be difficult. Hearing these words, the subordinate even got a little scared. I mean, it's hard if he's so tough. What's the problem? All the matter is that the guardian who guards the stone of return from this dungeon is truly a strong opponent with him. Not everyone can cope. Employee, yes. These two seem to know everything. If they're so strong, just need to pray that they'll be okay. Hearing that the boss wasn't at all confident that Jin would return alive, the employee grimaced pessimistically. And now, the necromancers along with his assistant came to some wasteland where there were only scorched trees. Turning his head around, Hong wondered, something definitely happened here. Why is the earth so lifeless here? But that didn't matter now. In front of them was an altar with a small crystal above it. It was the stone of return. Finally, they chose from here, can now return home. Kid already rushed to take possession of the crystal. But no sooner had the boy skipped a few steps than Jean caught him by the scruff of the neck and pulled him back with a sharp tug. The ground was literally gone from under my feet and slumped down. There were sharp spikes. Someone had bothered to set traps here. With a heavy sigh, the frightened Hong thanked Jin for saving him, but he should not have rushed forward so hastily. Seeing Jin staring somewhere with a pensive look, the boy asked what he saw there. But there was really nothing to see there. Several huge orcs were standing in front of them, their eyes glowing, and nothing good to expect from them. Even Jin didn't expect this. He was even a little surprised. Hong was scared out of his mind and didn't know what to do with these guys anyway. Alphen's orcs are strong opponents. Besides, they are several times the level of these two. The population of this world where Jin returned from is made up of many times, and even orcs are present there. But what are they doing here? As if nothing had happened. The necromancer took a few steps closer, and as if talking to an old acquaintance, asked why they were here. After saying that, Hong looked at him in surprise at what this master was up to. The orcs stopped in front of them. The huge monsters didn't move forward, they just looked amongst themselves. Here you heard something amazing. One of the orcs asked in surprise how this pathetic man knew their language and who he even was. But it didn't matter, Jean had already managed to learn this language perfectly and would ask again, why are they here? Hearing that these guys lost their home, Jin asked, did they get defeated by the supreme demon? Right, he realizes. Looking at the man with glowing eyes, the chief orc said that when the balance was broken, the demon became the master of everything, and here they are, because of the contract with him. Without saying anything else, the orc raised his massive axe up. The blade glinted in the sunset sunlight. Following the contract, this earth will be the new home of the orcs. The monster literally growled this phrase. Of course he was not going to back down. Taking out his armature, Jean asked, will there be any last words, or will they depart in silence? The orc commander ordered his army to advance, to attack immediately and destroy the wretched humans. Several massive monsters, snapping toothy mouths, moved forward to destroy the unfortunate humans. But neither Jin nor his companion moved. It was as if they were waiting for the orcs to get close enough. Surprisingly, the managers never left the entrance to the dungeon for a second. They had a good feeling for some reason. It had been over 6 hours, the chief thought. If you counted it that way, a whole day had passed in the dungeon. Based on this data, we can say that these two guys will definitely clean up this dungeon. But that's impossible. Suddenly, the barrier disappeared, and the two men dropped their eyes in surprise. This simply couldn't be. They certainly didn't expect this. The general manager just begged that these two come back alive and unharmed. This is their last chance to just let them come back alive. But no one appeared from the aisle. Employee already began to worry about the end of the captain immediately turned gloomy. He didn't want to accept that the man kept saying with just his lips that they should just come back here and let them come out now. Hearing a familiar voice, the man shrieked, yes, down in the dungeon. There were two guys, exactly the same guys. They were carrying the armor with them. The captain glowed with happiness. His eyes filled with joy. He was ready to cry and congratulated the guys on their return. Looking at him with a smile, Jin wondered why it was he was so happy, let only not describe. The survival kit wasn't much use to them, but the information was just as well. Jean didn't even realize crocodile skin was so expensive. Hong swallowed nervously and prepared himself for the bloody stones, but he would have to skin the monsters' bodies too. Suddenly, Jin looked out of the window and with surprised eyes began to survey the surroundings. Something had happened. Among all the people, Jin saw a familiar face. There was Min, along with some girl guy walking around the evening city. Hearing the familiar voice, Min turned his eyes to the side and fixed his glasses on his nose. From the car, Jin's familiar face looked up at him as he waved from the interior of the luxury car and cheered. The girl standing next to the old acquaintance twitched a little at the surprise and pulled on her hat. Jin wondered if Min was really on a date or what, but no, the guy said it was just his sister. The student said that it was the same person who helped him then in school. The girl remained silent and only sighed. Then she did look up and asked if this was really the Jin everyone was talking about. The necromancer looked at her with surprised eyes. Not only did she know his name, but she was staring at him so intently. Meanwhile, the head of the guild hammer came to the boss with the paper. The man sat in his cozy chair. Suddenly, the phone rang on the other end of the wire, announced that President Jin Woo had arrived. The two men immediately turned their heads. An unassuming man with glasses entered the room here, Leader Jung. Then it is clear. The manager immediately decided to go far away and quickly dashed through the door. The man only glanced at him obliquely. The man with the glasses asked, "What's with him acting so strange? He's having an exacerbation or something." The man with the beard said that this man had spotted a necromancer somewhere and wanted to make him vice president. The stranger smirked. But even if Leader Jung wants it that way, then there must be some reason for it. But everyone said that he had lost his grip. The man with the glasses smirked and said it was too much to stop relying on your prejudices. The bearded man clicked his teeth. It's all irrelevant how things are in America. He was extremely serious. The messenger replied that the rumors were true and everyone was just talking about it, and for a second, there was a tense silence between them. The man with the beard frowned, so it was true that the Titan had protected them. Then everything changed. The man appeared from the dungeon. Meanwhile, another woman stood in the office and looked out the wide window. She was being watched on multiple monitors, 2 people watching her every move, and she only said one word the whole time. It was like PTSD, she just keeps saying one single word. The man with long hair, being the head, ordered his secretary to get her to talk at least some way. It was the head of the Titan Guild named Ding Kun, who had been following the strange woman unceasingly the entire time. She, in turn, just stood in her room and said only one word, or rather name. She mentioned Jin. And now Min, sitting in his room, writing something with his pen moving quickly on a piece of paper. The guy was obviously worried about something. You never know what she was good at. This person naturally thought of Jin. Strange, this kid is weird after all. While at some cafe, Jin was drinking to excess. He found out that the girl's name was Ji-won, and she was Min's sister. The unfortunate blushed when Jin said she was all that pretty, even after all this time. But Jin lost all sense of tact and said that half of the school was in love with this girl, which embarrassed her. The guys kept showering her with compliments, and Ji-won blushed so much she looked like a tomato but couldn't say anything. Basically, what Jin said was true. This girl was beautiful and smart with everyone she got along with, and was the center of attention. Now she sat with a shot of drink in her hands and wondered if Jin had really been that blatant, or if she had missed something. Seeing the necromancer pay attention to her hat, the girl flinched and said she just liked it that way. Hong, who was sitting next to him, almost choked on his drink. He knew Jin was a frank person, but not that frank. Meanwhile, the necromancer kept insisting here it was too hot, why not take it off? He even reached out with his hand. How can you even ask a girl like that? Hong couldn't believe his eyes. Could it be that this person has never dated a girl? Looking behind his every move, Hong realized more and more that Jin Woo definitely likes this girl, except that he is completely unable to communicate. At this rate, the girl will just lose her temper and run away from them. Deciding to lighten up the atmosphere with something, Hong proposed to play a game. Everyone was surprised and looked at him. The guy was already under the influence of alcohol. Jin looked at his companion in surprise. What kind of game is he talking about? It was obvious that the guy was annoyed. It was a game of drink, 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 drink. On the table already stood a few bottles of alcohol, so they decided to get drunk. Hong He was already intoxicated with unprecedented enthusiasm, and even began to sing. The guy mumbled something about dislocated shoulders and tugged at his shirt in theatrical gestures. Eventually, Jin got sick of it and said that if Hong didn't stop fooling around, the necromancer would break all his bones. Finally settled down and sat back in his seat, all 2 of them looked at the girl who was lying on the table. I think she was drunk out of her mind and had already fallen asleep at the table. Suddenly, her Panama came off the girl's head and Hong blushed instantly at what he saw. The guy was also pretty drunk, and he thought he saw some other girl suddenly looking at them. She too saw something amazing, and immediately turned away. Ji-won had a large burn on her head. It was only now that Hong realized what he had seen, and was immediately startled by the stain on the girl's head. Jin saw it too, but he didn't seem to react in any way. He just looked at her with an unblinking gaze. A drunken Jiwon lay on the table and just slept, completely oblivious to the huge scar on her head. Jesus Christ, what a reaction. Jean calmly took out his Panama and put it back on the girl's head. She was fine anyway. The next morning, Jiwon woke up with a terrible headache and a hangover. It seems she had had quite a bit too much to drink last night. She turned her head, and the first person she saw was her brother, who was cooking something, but the girl didn't understand how she ended up at home. Min tasted his cooking, asked, "Doesn't she remember her Jin brought her here? Let her go wash up." Once in the bathroom, she looked in the mirror and was horrified that she had forgotten about her hat when she fell asleep. Though her memory slowly began to return to her, really Jean was carrying her in his arms, straight home. Finally, he saw the scar. A scared girl looking at her reflection in the mirror, there was a look of fear there. It was then 5 years ago that she got that horrible scar and really didn't want anyone to see it. But suddenly she remembered that phrase Jean had said, no matter what she was still beautiful, and put the hat back on. Jiwon blushed instantly. She realized that this guy hadn't changed a bit. He was still as good-natured as he was then. The day was nearing dusk, and the local school had finished lessons in the classroom, figuring out who was on duty today. The events were transported back to years ago when Jean himself was still a schoolboy. He raised his hand and said he was on duty. When the boy saw who would be on duty in class with him today, he immediately blushed. The girl he would be on duty with was Jiwon. She raised her hand and said she would be on duty with him tonight. Finally, in less than half an hour, they had cleaned everything up and were already closing the classroom. Jin turned back around and saw a classmate. Jiwon was very pretty and popular. She looked at her classmate with a good-natured look. They went to the exit of the school. On the way, the girl said something about her brother and that he was in the transition age, and he was just as quiet. She smiled and suggested Jin why now get along better. They hadn't talked in quite a while after all. The guy just looked at her. Suddenly, the classmate stopped, and the girl said, "There was something I should say in his ear. Let him lean over." Jean obeyed. The girl leaned toward him and began to whisper something, but the guy didn't have time to hear it. A few seconds passed, and Jean woke up. The first thing he saw in front of his face was the muzzle of the cat that woke him up. What a good morning. Jean wrinkled his nose and prepared to destroy the hated animal, but what a dream she had interrupted for him. The next morning, the local hotel was as usual full of visitors. People were walking around in their seats. Someone was minding their own business. Hong was sitting at one of the tables and typing something on his laptop. Apparently the guy was up to his ears in work when suddenly he saw Jin. The one woke up and was already there. Necromancer asked, did the guy find the level 4 dungeon? The manager was in the process. He was quickly tapping his fingers on the keyboard, but such dungeons were not that many to find, still need to try. The thing is that high-level guilds have already reserved most of these dungeons for themselves, so it's hard to find something. Then something must be done. Jin pondered, then maybe another level 3 dungeon to clean up would be logical in principle. Suddenly, he had an idea, guy. Took his phone out of his pocket and dialed a number signed as Wimpy seems. Arjun is already blackmailing someone again. On the other end of the phone came someone's frightened voice, a man saying he was coming. In a menacing voice, Jean said he had a quarter of an hour, but he didn't have time for more, and the man on the other end immediately agreed. Hong wondered who it is that the mentor is calling. Jin smiled, and he himself, as he thinks, let him guess, there are several attempts. To the man who repays his debt naturally, Jean smiled, he was exploiting someone again. A few minutes later, Master Jung appeared. The man was in a great hurry and barely breathing. He had already waved his hand to the old acquaintances. And he's even faster than expected. Jin smiled. Apparently, he wants to get a tidbit of the tidbit. The boss was breathing heavily and immediately apologized for making him wait. They wanted something from him. Jung also started looking for a level 4 dungeon, although people do that, but a forum is not a better idea. The man began to search. Hong came to delight. It was an exclusive program from the Guild for Advanced Search. Master Jung did not miss the opportunity to start sucking up. He offered the most favorable conditions, and even a cozy room. Jean was in a much better mood today than the previous days, and somehow agreed with a smile on his face. The master motioned the laptop to him and asked to see here was a list of dungeons that could be reserved. A few minutes later, they were already standing at the entrance to one of the dungeons. The 4th level had gotten reserved quickly enough. Good if they have some time, the master suggested having some tea and chatting at leisure. Besides, Jung hoped to give a little briefing before entering the dungeon. It would be helpful, Jin and Here agreed. The necromancer even shuddered as the master moved towards Jin and said that this information might interest him very much. Nearby standing Hong was looking around with surprised eyes. The guy saw something interesting. The dungeon was being reconfigured. It was changing in front of my eyes, and the entire space began to fill with a bright blue color. It was the first time the kid had seen something like this. and Jung looked in the same direction with surprised eyes and cried out. He immediately ordered his subordinate to hurry up immediately and call the guild. Even Jin, having a very long experience, first heard of something like this. What does it mean to reconfigure the dungeon? It somehow changes. The reporters with their cameras immediately rushed there. The journalist was already saying something. She was reporting live from the scene. There were military men everywhere, and they had already put up signs saying no trespassing and were driving the curious away from the scene. It looked like the mine stage had already been completed. People piled in even tighter and began to examine the incident. Jung decided to explain what happened to the dungeon, and his status could be divided into 3 categories. The man smiled. The first is the mine, actually, the place where people hunt monsters and get bloodstones. The second reconfiguration, and the third and most powerful, is the dungeon ripping, unleashes a huge amount of monsters outward. The very dungeons they were clearing were still called mines, where players usually go down to get crystals. They have been mopped up at least once. When this happens, new base monsters are spawned. The mine stage lasts about 2 to 3 months. Then there is a reconfiguration and a new dungeon. The master explained that from now on, the other guilds would try to clear this dungeon faster than anyone else, and the gap, and then the master faltered. Seeing Jin's face, the man immediately realized that the necromancer was going to be the first to clear this dungeon, but there was nothing stopping him. The master shouted, "It's impossible! Such a dungeon after reconfiguration is much more dangerous than a normal dungeon. There are strong monsters, and it's dealt with by guilds." "I get it. So Jung wants his guild to run this dungeon himself," Master blurted out. The master explained that the contract says only one person can own the dungeon, but only after people measure its energy. Speaking of which, several people with some strange device had already approached the dungeon and started measuring energy. If the dungeon is level 4, it has a rank of C. If it is level 5, it has a rank of B. And if it is level 6 and above, then only guilds of rank A and above can enter. He smiled, and now he had the privilege of entering a level 4 dungeon. Well, that sounds wonderful. Seeing that this dungeon was actually a level 5 dungeon, the necromancer even got a little depressed. That was a problem. The master was standing next to him and smirked at him, so he would have to surrender. The people who crowded around the dungeon looked in horror before them. They saw something amazing. In front of them was Joe Jack's team, including that Yunhee girl. They seemed to be well known here. The master tensed up as it looked like the Huaran Guild was going to take over this dungeon, and they were already targeting it for sure. But Jean wasn't really interested in that. He was fixated on the girl who'd beaten him. The guy remembered how she had looked at him arrogantly and advised him not to cross her path. Well, no, Jean wasn't going to give up that easily, especially this is the perfect chance to avenge this humiliation. Spreading his arms, the guy said happily, "But if there's an awakened person of this level here, it'll be a cakewalk to clear the dungeon." Yunhee looked at him and gritted her teeth. Again, that annoying Jin can't bother her eyes. Completely losing all sense of tact, Jin stepped closer and began to examine her armor, a first-class piece. The girl glanced at him and grinned at him. "This is a level 5 dungeon, so he has no business being here. Let him get the hell out of here." But Jin only smiled and looked at her. Of course, he wasn't going to back down, especially now. He started begging like a child. "Let's not be so mean. Well, at least we can see if we can or not." Yunhee was furious when she saw that insolent man touching her, who told him that he could reach out to her like that. There were still people walking around. They were discussing the new dungeon that appeared right in the middle of the city. It was a general furor. Suddenly, passers-by began to notice that there was something going on everywhere. There was a large gathering of people discussing something among themselves. Unable to tolerate such insolent behavior, Yunhee swung her leg and wanted to hit the insolent Jin right in the face. Let him get his hands off. The girl at the last moment saw Jin about to fall into the dungeon. She wanted to warn him, but it was too late. Pushing off of the first step, Jin flew straight into the portal at last. He only smiled and sort of waved at them. The rest of us just stood at the top and flapped our eyes, unable to do anything. It was all over. This is very bad. People started fussing and trying to find some way out of the situation, but no one could think of what to do. The frightened Hong froze in place, still holding the 2 cups of some kind of drink he brought to his master. After flying through the portal, Jin found himself in some strange place. Now he looked like a Bedouin, and all around was the desert and unbearable heat. But no sooner had the necromancer come to his senses than something appeared from under the earth, and with great force hit him in the back that the guy even flew up. A huge round mouth full of razor-sharp teeth appeared below. It was some kind of monster that looked like a worm. They certainly don't know how to say hello. Jean flew up and froze in midair, watching from above. It was time to deal with this rude monster. The guy swung at him and hit him with his stick. Monsters always remain monsters. Whatever they look like, the guy smiled. There is a long and painstaking job to be done. But to his great surprise, the worm looked at him and opened its wide maw. Worse, there were already several of these monsters here. Apparently they heard their comrades call and came out in a pack. Several worms began to entangle the boy and soon entwined themselves into some monstrous lump. Without putting up with it for long, Jin struck a few hard blows, and the whole pile of worms was turned into a pile of meat in no time. In the end, the necromancer was alive and well. It was good that he realized his level after the first worm. Otherwise, there would have been trouble in his hands. He had a spear in his hand. Turning his head to the side, Jin noticed some soccer ball-like creatures approaching him with great speed. He's only done with one, and there's a dozen more of them here. The necromancer swung his spear straight at one of the monsters to strike for sure, or at least to hit it, and a rumbling sound was heard. And then Jin freaked out by the explosion means these monsters are exploding or what, then it's even more of a problem. Several round balls were already approaching him at a tremendous speed, and were about to turn him into a cutlet. In the end, after the monstrous explosion, luckily Jin was still alive. He was holding on to some bone. In the end, he managed to build a protective barrier. So much for a level 5 dungeon. Taking out of his pocket some bottle with a potion, the guy began to drink it greedily. It was a restorative elixir, just in time. A smile immediately appeared on his face, a very different dungeon from what he had seen before. Upstairs, there was still panic. People were crowded around the dungeon and didn't know what to do. Man fell through there without help. Somebody started muttering and it was getting tiresome. Hong replied that his friend was not just there, but cleaning up the dungeon. But nobody believed it. Some of the players thought Jin was a coward for just going to the other side before he could even do anything, which was confusing. On the other hand, you just have to trust him and wait. The aide stood leaning against the small fence and pondered. Principal Jung walked over to him and looked at the kid with a worried look. Couldn't Jin definitely handle it? Raising his evil eyes, Hong nodded his head, of course. His mentor would definitely come out of there alive, otherwise there was no other way. Encouraged by such a story, the chief asked to tell about this guy's abilities and to get to know him better. However, this was classified information that could not be divulged. Hong shook his head and turned away from his superior. This teenager was quite stubborn and would definitely not tell everything willingly, apparently very loyal to this necromancer. The principal looked at the dungeon. In case this Jin came back, it would mean that he was incredibly strong. Another awakened rank. A has appeared, and this news is going to shock the world. This has never happened before. Meanwhile, Jin was busy exterminating the local fauna. He was destroying one of the scorpions, with ease separating the limbs. The skeletons here were just right. By the way, they helped to deal with the countless insects that kept popping up from the ground. Finished with these! Jin exhaled heavily before the next summoning. He only had one more level to hold on to. But there was another problem. The desert is just huge. No matter how many times the guy goes through, it still doesn't end everywhere, just sand. Luckily, after a few hours on the road, the necromancer spotted the abandoned city of Lucretia and immediately headed there, walking through the streets. Looking around, Jin didn't feel anyone living here, and it looked like the city had been empty for decades. But his calmness did not last long. After a second, something flew past the guy and with great speed crashed into the skeleton, destroying it. Jin gritted his teeth in anger and took a closer look at someone who definitely wanted him to go to the other side of the world. But who was it? 3 beings appeared before my eyes. The upper half of their bodies were human, and the lower half like snakes. They were Nagas, mythical beings in Buddhism. The most important of them, a huge purple-skinned monster, hissed. Let the outsider state the reason why he invaded their temple. Jin came to his senses a little, and it all became clear to him. No wonder this place looks familiar. This is the temple of Arya Monster wondered. However, one question remained unresolved. What a follower of this goddess is doing on Earth, especially in such a place, is the demon and her defeated. The serpent came to rage. How this lowly man dares to insult their great goddess. They cooperate with the demon just to punish the cultists. And this is already interesting. Necromancers listened. What other cults snakes confirmed? Yes, they fight them, and quietly for centuries. These are the human apostates of the blue-eyed priestess, who left Alphen and fled to Earth. Now they rule here. Jin wondered what other blue-eyed priestess this he had not heard. On the other hand, the guy didn't think long. He can't let these monsters hit the ground, and armed with his spear, rushed to attack. But the monsters were determined, before going to Earth for their deeds, they would destroy this pathetic human. Even though socializing wasn't my thing, I still had to talk to them. These monsters are able to hide their magical energy. With skeletons coping with these snakes will be very difficult. Having to increase the number of the army, Jin ordered another dozen skeletons to appear on the ground. The monsters have started to come out of the sand. Now maybe we can get a handle on these snakes at last. Their form had also changed. Now the skeletons didn't look so helpless. Now they were wearing something resembling armor. Well, even so, it's going to be tough with the Nagas. They're too strong. They'll crush skeletons in a heartbeat. Even so, they would regret every blow they missed. A smile appeared on Jin's face. Now he would show these worms where they truly belonged. And the monster only smiled, showing his two fangs. What is this man thinking to himself? Does he really intend to fight here? The other monsters also moved to attack. They armed themselves with long spears and flew straight at the man. The clanging of weapons was heard. Even the rankest snake was striking hard. Jin could feel the recoil in his entire body. At some point, the guy felt a huge spear approaching him from behind and quickly turned his head around. It only took one blow to separate the head of one of the monsters from the body with a crunch and a final scream. Then something very massive began to fall from the sky. Jin was moving at an incredible speed. He tried to get out of the line of attack, stopped increasingly difficult. On the roof of one of the houses stood several of these same monsters. Probably they were the ones throwing their spears to strike the guy down. Immediately, the necromancer began throwing energy spears at them. The monsters quickly hid behind a ledge of rock and tried to get away. Taking advantage of the confusion, one of the worms approached the boy and had already prepared his spear for the next strike. But Jin's incredible speed built a fortress of bones around him and thus blocked the monsters from advancing. Yeah, they don't get in the way. Jin thought a bit about it. They'd be a bit difficult to deal with, and they act pretty coherently. Okay, still a difference in levels, but they are trained in many melee attacks, good fighters. However, here even Bibi and his skeletons won't help. The necromancer has to manage his own powers somehow. Although Jin can't use only skeleton soldiers, but these monsters are damn fast, so it will be impossible to win. In the real world, all the news reports said only one person fell into the new dungeon and still no rumors about him. Sitting in his office, a guild employee of the Hammer Guild watched everything happening through the TV screen and sighed at having come all this way just to show off. Master Young couldn't find his new ward in a new dungeon, and who knows what will happen to him there. The man saw how bad Han was and handed him a bowl of soup to eat. It's not good enough to faint. The boy was out of his mind. Even if his comrade was suffering, he himself was safe here and could do nothing. In his hands, he had a plate of noodle soup and some eggs, but not a single bite would go down his throat. His comrade was in trouble. After a few minutes of deliberation, the decision was made to at least eat a little bit of food. I need to torture myself like this. In the desolate world of the new dungeon, the necromancer's entire army was defeated by snakes, much stronger than expected. Main Naga crawled up to Jinu and asked in surprise, is this the very thing the kid was going to invade their shrine with? Even funny. Letting the mockery pass his ears, the boy smiled as the dungeon proved to be more problematic than expected. The monster smiled. The kid was in no position to bluff. Let him at least take care of his life. He was done. But no, Jin was not bluffing at all. The monster stopped and looked at the strange alien with surprised eyes. You see, he's upped his game, and now there are some new moves. He can't wait to try on these punching bags. Serpent covered himself with his hands from the powerful flash of light. So as not to be blinded, something began to change. I didn't understand anything. Suddenly, there was a rumbling sound, and someone very large and massive appeared in front of the monster. Naga lifted his head up. The serpent did not realize what had just happened. He opened his mouth in surprise and froze in place, unable to say a word. After the summoning, a huge golem woven of sand and clay appeared on the ground, with Jin and himself sitting on top and controlling the huge monster. A second later, the monster began swinging his huge arms and delivering monstrous blows on the sand, trying to hit the pesky snakes. Now, the Nagi were like bugs. They were spreading out in different directions in an attempt to save their lives from this monster. The commander ordered his soldiers to line up the rest of the monsters struggling with fear, tried to come to their senses. Jin only got into the excitement. He aimed his huge sand servant straight at his enemies to crush with a single blow. The golem opened his wide yellow mouth and roared, his roar spreading across the desert and seeming to be heard by every living creature. The soldiers, although they were much smaller, rushed into the battle armed with spears and were not going to retreat so easily. After a few dozen minutes, only the commander was left. He looked in front of him with a frightened look and did not know what to do. The whole army was defeated. Jin approached him with a wobbly gait. Did this monster have nothing else to oppose but his insignificant army? Gritting his teeth, the main monster didn't know what to say. His army had been defeated, leaving only him alone. Even so, he wouldn't give up. His body began to deform, his teeth lengthened, and his face became even more horrifying. A second later, a huge ghost hammer appeared in the necromancer's hands. The guy swung and prepared to use the vortex. The serpent was flying at him, and Jin was just waiting for him to take advantage of the moment and kill the serpent once and for all. A second later, a massive vortex like a tornado appeared, only overflowing with sand. Everything around it began to rise from its seats. After a second, the wind died down, leaving only Jin and the huge serpent, who was already at the end of his strength and stood with his head tilted. And he was much more persistent than expected. Even after such a blow, he stayed on his feet, which he is trying to prove. The serpent roared with rage and powerlessness. He never thought that someone so strong would be born on Earth. Well, he would have to improvise. And at the same moment, Naga turned into a huge snake. Several meters long, he opened a wide mouth and rushed at his opponent. Jin wasn't afraid of that. He just swung his hammer and hit the huge monster right in the jaw with a crunch. For someone who's about to go to the other world, this serpent talks too much. It's time to end. The necromancer is tired. All this time in our real world, people were crowding around the dungeon, and some had already started to set up tents. Hong sat on the bare ground and ate noodles. Even though everything had happened, he was still tormented by a terrible feeling of guilt. The boy was about to put another portion in his mouth when suddenly he heard a familiar voice behind him and froze. Jin finally came back alive and well and extremely happy to have something to share. And by the way, he wanted noodles too. Reporters, of which there were a whole bunch, immediately rushed to him with questions. The whole space was illuminated by the flashes of TV cameras. The first to run up to him was Hong and start asking how he was feeling, but Jin just sighed and said it was easy with this tale. Turning his head to the side, the necromancer saw Yunhee. The girl was also standing here looking at him. Only what was she forgetting here? And then Jin decided that it was a pity how she could push him into that dungeon. It was dangerous. And if he didn't survive. But the girl only looked at him through her eyebrows. She looked at the necromancer with surprised and frightened eyes, who he was after all. The reporters kept clicking their cameras. It was a sensation. They had to publish the article faster. Everyone was trying to get a tidbit. Jin just stood there and enjoyed his fame. He had achieved what he wanted, at least for a while. The manager was about to go home, when suddenly the TV announced the breaking news on Friday morning at the Seoul University station exit. There was an event. Hearing that someone had fallen into the dungeon and was able to get out of it, the man was stunned. Jin was being interviewed on TV. The guy didn't even know what to say. It was the first time he'd ever faced so much attention. Jung immediately jumped up to him and began to put the cameras away. Jin had just returned from a dangerous dungeon stop filming. The man couldn't believe his eyes. How the hell he was able to sweep the level 5 dungeons by himself, what rank he had at all. And then Jung's words came to mind. He was sure that this strange guy had outstanding abilities, and the man wasn't lying. But at that time, the guild leader didn't take his words seriously and just thought that it was just another bullshit to make a farce. Still looking at the monitor. Leader pondered, if we can get this guy, then the guild will be the first with 3 awakened ones. The man jumped in place and almost clapped his hands. He knew his head wouldn't fail, though of course he doubted it. In a short time, there were gourmet dishes on the table, and it was necessary to have a good meal. Someone poured flavored tea into a mug, heard a voice. They were making good progress. A lot of people were involved here. Sang-ho's face appeared in front of us, and he said not to worry, everything would be fine. The man was very serious. Across from the master sat the minister. He laughed and said he always knew he could rely on him. But suddenly came a message on the phone. Master took the device in his hands and immediately stunned. He could not believe what he read. The minister immediately noticed the fear on his comrade's face, but Sang-ho smiled and politely said it was okay. He didn't want to show his fear. Naturally, it was news that Jin had gotten the highest rank. If this continues, the world we know will be destroyed. It was then that the master spoke about it, but Jin ignored his words. The man kept thinking about it. Then he really asked the guy to help them. But Jin coldly refused. He had his own goals, obviously, that he was pursuing. At that moment, the necromancer smiled and said that it was all just lip service to the fact that the master was just a fake. Then Sang-ho smiled. He realized that the guy didn't trust him yet, but he hoped they would still meet someday. And now the master decided to ask the minister a small favor. The politician was surprised and looked at the old acquaintance. Of course, he was answered in the affirmative. The master smiled and thanked the minister for such benevolence. A sly smile appeared on the man's face as he thought of all the ways to get this man. At that moment, a student was sitting in his house and writing something passionately. He did not even pay attention to the swearing nearby. The boy tried to type with a pen on his notebook, but the swearing nearby and loud shouting prevented him from concentrating. Turning his head towards Min shrieked, "He is actually here studying for exams. Can you turn down the sound a little?" Jin had come to his house again and brought his buddy Hong with him, and now they were sitting around watching some kind of melodrama. Jin did turn the sound halfway down on the screen with some love movie or something. The unfortunate students took his head in their hands, and now he has a cat in his house, but he can't have two assholes. The student wondered if they don't worry about it at all. The guys looked at him. What else do they have to worry about? But at least there's a whole bunch of reporters waiting for someone to come out to them. That's okay. Let them go. The guys were getting really pissed off and asking Min to go out and buy them tangerines or some goodies. The student grimaced at the fact that he had exams coming up. He didn't hire himself as a food delivery boy. It was enough that these two were living at his house. But when the boy saw the two rustling banknotes, he immediately agreed. Besides, Jean generously allowed him to keep the change for himself. Suddenly, the guy's phone rang. The necromancer looked at the device and raised an eyebrow in surprise at who else had to do it. On the other end of the line was Mom. She was saying something to the reporters. But Gina, it didn't really bother me. I'd already gotten her two right. Finding out that these people keep coming every day, Necromancer got a little pissed off. Yeah, I can't take it anymore. After a second, the guy got a little sad and agreed to pick up some stuff when he could. You could tell by the look on his face that he was upset. Hong immediately noticed this and asked, "What's up?" Jin hung up the phone and addressed him by name and exhaled. Hong very much surprised when his master asked, "Is Korea still divided?" But yes, it was like that. But after such news, Jin is furious even the dungeon appears, and they are still on opposite sides of the barricade. The boy looked at him and understood nothing. Why, that clonk has always been like that and will most likely stay that way. Jin's eyes faded instantly, and he said in a heavy voice that he had received a summons to the army. The sorcerer stood up on the spot. This is not the way things are going to work, or he will be sent to the battlefield. Gritting his teeth, Jin suggested that we just destroy the leader of North Korea and be done with it. Then there would be no problem. But then a large-scale battle cannot be avoided. The ruler of the northern part of Korea is a very evil man, as apparently belligerent. But no, even that didn't stop Jin. He was going to unify Korea once and for all, even if it cost him a lot. Hong grabbed onto Jin's shirt and started to stop him. If you destroy one of the rulers, Korea will simply never unite. But there were just no other options. The guy looked at his friend and said that was the best thing to come up with at that moment. Eventually, Min came back into the room, and seeing such a funny picture of two guys standing in a very provocative pose froze him in place. The student raised an eyebrow and looked at his friends, what they were even up to here at least. Let them have a conscience. Eventually, Jin told him what was wrong, but the student wasn't too worried about the awakened ones not being sent off like regular soldiers. Although, on the other hand, if Jin doesn't want to join the army, he can just serve his country in some other way, but how to do that? The only way out was to go to the guild to ask to join and help them fight monsters. At this rate, you will do a little less. After all, even Min himself, someday in the future, dreams of becoming part of a large guild. It is quite prestigious. Yes, and money can be made. Hong totally lowered his head. How did it even happen that he didn't know about it? The guy felt guilty and didn't know what to say. Meanwhile, in the Guild of Youngsters, there was a buzz of excitement. One of the staff was jumping in place and shouting that they had finally made the boss look out. Holding a mug of flavored drink in his hands, Jung wondered what they had done to scream like that. The thing was, the Jin himself wants to meet with them and talk about the guild. On the employee's face, a smile shone on his face. Maybe he even wants to sign a contract and join the guild. Jung almost choked. He was immediately reminded of the conversation, and when the necromancer asked how they could help him in this situation, the puzzles came together. And then the master offered information the guy can't refuse. Even then, the master behaved with the utmost sincerity, trying to favor this necromancer in order to gain his favor. And then the man finally began to realize, could it be that after so many attempts, Jin was still paying attention to him? It was another feat of no hurry to rejoice. He sipped a few sips and asked for a little quieter. Having corrected his expensive jacket, he got up from his seat and said that he would prepare the present, and the rest of the group should start preparing for the reception. The main office, someone knocked. The man sitting in the chair, twitched, and prepared to greet the guests. Master Jung entered the room. His colleague immediately greeted him and asked how the negotiations with the new candidate were going. The supervisor replied that Jean had ogled them to arrive with a conversation. The man was delighted. What wonderful news. He grabbed the head by the arm and started shaking him. Jung, once again, did just fine. That's why the head is here, by the way. He'd like to talk about the vice president position. The leader. If the head asks for something, they will immediately fulfill his request. Thanks to him, the Hammer Guild is now in first place in Korea. In the end, the man waved to Jung and wished him a good journey, and he was in a great mood. A local cafe has been rented for tonight's dinner, and they've been ordered to do everything to the best of their ability to please everyone. Master Jung was already sitting there, and on his face was an extremely perplexed man who didn't understand what he had just heard. Jin sat in front of him, and with a smile on his face, he offered to form his own guild with him to advance further. A surprised Jung looked at his companion. Didn't Jin come here to join their guild? But the necromancer shook his head. The man grabbed his head. He thought he had the guy on the hook and would be able to get such a valuable specimen in his collection. In the end, even the subordinate couldn't stand it. He asked Jean how they could benefit from doing it. But people's mouths dropped open in surprise when they heard the fabulous sum of $1 million. They couldn't believe their eyes. But Jean claimed $1 million over their annual salary. Let them add that to their repertoire if they want. The boss couldn't believe his ears. But it's not just about money, it's also about authority. Besides, he's the guild manager of the Hammer Guild. Doesn't Jin realize how difficult this position is for him? And how will people even look at him when she moves to another guild because of money? Jin only sighed. Folding his hands in front of him, the necromancer could guarantee that they would become even bigger than the Hammer Guild he had asked to be the founder of. When the conversation was over, everyone went home. The car was speeding down the wide highway. A subordinate sat behind the wheel and said that he was going to accept this necromancer's offer. Jung almost swallowed his tongue. This is, after all, a betrayal of pure water. He looked at his subordinate and wondered, doesn't that sound cool? Jin awakened. Of the highest rank offers to start a guild? Employee was worried, even if he stayed in the guild hammer, how high he could climb the career ladder. Jung himself realized that based on the way Jin rated dungeons, he had a much brighter future than the guilds. On the other hand, even in their guild, moving up the career ladder is quite difficult, considering the state of affairs. Everyone who has asked for a promotion has been refused. Jung and himself should be grateful that he is not ridiculed, but simply ignored. Eventually, the supervisor agreed. Yes, he too would accept this offer. The employee looked at him in surprise. On the other hand, to go a little higher, you have to take risks. Who doesn't take risks doesn't drink champagne, as they say. The aide took out of his pocket the invitation registration letter he seemed to always carry with him. Such are they office workers. The guy smiled and nodded his head. Then they have a good future ahead of them. The head seemed to have carried the invitation with him as well. Jung pulled out the exact same sheet of paper. The letter was considerably wrinkled, but Jung smiled. Such they are office workers, then go ahead. The car was picking up speed. The decision was made to go and get well drunk before quitting my job. For some reason, the lights in the building were completely off Jung, and so the aide went inside and began to look around the dark room. As soon as Jung entered the room, the lights immediately came on, and the clappers started going off to congratulate him on his vice presidential position. Here were all the employees, a man with a beard spreading his arms, congratulating him on his position as vice president of the support company. They even brought him a cake with candles to blow out and make a wish, although what else to wish for? The rest of his colleagues also congratulated him and asked him not to forget them after his promotion. Jung stood in front of them, thrown with clappers and confetti. The man didn't even know what to say. It was awkward. The chief pointed at him with his hand and said that this genius just completed a successful negotiation, should be applauded by all. Meanwhile, Jung stood there not knowing what to say to him, terribly embarrassed to feel like a man in such a situation. The president didn't even want to listen to anything. He offered to organize a lavish feast in honor of the new vice president. They even made reservations at a nice restaurant, for all the man didn't pay any attention at all to the fact that Jung was embarrassed. Meanwhile, the vice president chuckled nervously. He didn't even know what to say. It was all so fast that the man didn't have time to think about it. Eventually, they went to an expensive restaurant. There was live music. A man sat at a piano and played a tune. Meanwhile, the head and his assistant were puzzling over what to do in such a situation. It literally drove him crazy. You can't just take off and leave. He had no idea what to do either, and just stood there like a pillar. You can't just leave everything like that, can you? Suddenly, the aide gave his head a registration letter. Jung stood his ground and didn't understand what all this was about. The deputy grinned. One of them should definitely leave. You can't talk about it in a situation like this. The man waved his hand. He would go first. There was no way the head would refuse such a position. Everything was in his hands now. Suddenly, the founder walked up to the vice president and grabbed his arm. What's he standing there for? Let him join the others. Everyone wants to hear about his exploits. Jung didn't know what to say. He didn't even successfully negotiate. The president stood in front of him with all the others and waved his hands in front of him, ready to listen. Jung didn't know what to say. He was very worried, and the president only laughed from the sidelines. He found it cute. With his hands folded in front of him, the vice president said he'd screwed up for a second, and everyone fell silent, not knowing what to say. The president, already drunk, did not realize what had happened at once, and looked at his colleague with a stupid expression on his face. Jung bowed and said he screwed up this contract and apologized. Everyone around him was silent. The president began to shake with rage. He clenched his hands. The alcohol immediately receded. The man didn't even know what to say. Poking his finger at a fellow president, he shouted that he meant it and said, "How is this even possible? Apologizing isn't going to cut it." Does Jung want to get fired? But the vice president just bowed out. Yeah, he'd appreciate it if they fired him now, minus one problem. And the president went on a rampage. They have no idea how many resources were spent on this contract and how it will all turn out in the end. True to Jung's own understanding, he had cleared out the dungeon for Jin to use unhindered. Paying people to adjust his rank so he wouldn't be considered a loser, all of this required a lot of money. Going into a lot of debt to hire him was a lot of money. Jung had done a lot of damage, and now he didn't know how to get out of the situation without being dishonorably discharged. The man said he was going to take full responsibility. The president was still furious, how he was going to fix it like that. Pushing up the registration letter, Jung said she would voluntarily resign for what she had done. But that's not going to fix it. The president said that Jung's the boss now, and that he thinks stepping back will fix everything. Runs away as soon as he has done such a bad thing, man. Even laughed. Yes, where is it seen? How else to explain it to him? Jung was lost in speculation. He just wants to retire, that's all that's strange. Deciding not to explain anything more, the vice president turned around and lived in good evening, left the president, understood nothing. He was still shouting something after his colleague, cursing and swearing at him, but he wasn't listening. It was a new start. The former vice president walked out of the opulent office with a clear conscience and sighed heavily. There, a familiar voice was already waiting for him. A colleague called him over here. Jung looked at him in surprise. That's news. He's still here. The comrade stood by the car and beckoned to his colleague. Where would he go without him, without his boss? Let him quickly jump in the car. The employee smiled. Eventually, the two former Hammer employees had already arrived at Jin's place, and he spread his arms to welcome them to a new guild called Adril. Jung and his coworker just stood there watching, and they couldn't believe their eyes. Everything was happening rather quickly. The necromancer confirmed, yes, that would be their name. Jin smiled and shook his head. They shook hands in the hope that they would have great success in the future, need to try hard. Jung confirmed that they will work as hard as they can to get their new guild on everyone's lips, so they will. Already excited, Jin asked if he could address his new colleague less formally, but it was a little awkward. The man preferred to just be called the head. He was terribly uncomfortable with being treated so normally. The registration and preparation of the guild, Jin decided to leave it to his new deputy. Let him handle it. And now, we can get good drunk. The guy gave a thumbs up and suggested that everyone should have a good celebration. But is that really the end of the meeting? Jung was a little stunned. Well, what else is there to discuss? Jung will be in charge, and Jin will do whatever needs to be done. That's it. After that, the newly elected deputy was a bit stunned, and in general, it was normal for the guild founder to behave so carelessly. Something about this behavior didn't seem responsible to the new employee, but it seems Jin wasn't thinking about that at all. Besides, we need to put off the acquaintance a bit for later. Now there's something to be decided. Jung approached his boss. Already about to start drinking, Woojin looked at him with surprised eyes. What else does he need? But the thing was that it was necessary to talk about how they would go to raids because the new guild would face stiff competition in the market. Jin decided to do everything. Pragmatically, just allow other players to use the dungeon, he himself can raid it. But the man was sure that it would be better to allow the use of the dungeon when Jin himself was resting. It was indeed a sensible idea. But that wasn't all. Jung said that registering a guild required at least 5 members. Well, Jin thought about it. He already had one person in mind who was eager to join the guild. By unanimous decision of 2 people, they decided to take Min, but something it didn't seem like a good plan. An underage teenager doesn't fit. Looking at his phone, Jin was a little disappointed he had so few people. He knew only a few numbers. Mom is naturally also not suitable. You should not force her to expose herself to danger. What to do then is not clear. But suddenly Jin's eyes brightened up. There's a man in sight. You just have to call him. There was a knock on the door, and the familiar silhouette of the fat man from the store appeared on the doorstep. Jin immediately waved him over. The necromancer immediately asked if he had brought the indication code and the seal. The fat man was stomping at the entrance and mumbling something to himself. Yes, he had brought it, but there was one thing. As soon as Jin reached for him with his hand, the unfortunate fatty squirmed and deflected in memory. There were still fresh moments of him being beaten. But Jin wasn't even going to do him any harm. Instead, he welcomed the new guild member. The fatty stood in front of him and flapped his eyes. He didn't understand. What guild member of what guild? What are we talking about here? In the end, the main office began to be organized. Everyone moved furniture to arrange at least an office to gather there. In the end, after a few hours, everything was finished. Now it at least looks human, and something can be done here. Everyone did a good job. Now the office was ready, there were several computers, and it looked more like something like a guild. Until yesterday, Fatty, whose name was Hong, thought he was being pranked, but now it turns out they have a pretty serious intention. Fatty couldn't believe he was now hired by the man who beat him up for a cell phone. What's more, this psycho is a world-famous personality who defends the dungeon alone. All day long, their boss is all over the news. Of course, he's the new awakened legend of the city, so to speak. Taking a closer look at the two colleagues, Hong realized that Jin had poached them from the Hammer Guild, but how? The man himself was glad that in life, finally, something changed in his life was not so good. Things were going just sitting in the store. When asked how Hong knew their boss, the guy twitched a bit, not wanting to talk about it. However, the coworker wouldn't budge. They must have been too close because Fatty came running as soon as he got the call. At the end, the celebrant himself appeared. Jean looked around with a triumphant look. The office looks beautiful. The necromancer stood and looked at the result of his own actions. It seems the guy was very pleased with everything slowly starting to work out. Everyone thanked him for his work, and someone asked if Jean had finished leaving the list of dungeons. The necromancer got a little busy but nodded, but immediately said that it was Hong. The kid was standing somewhere behind and breathing heavily. Oh my god, Jin is doing all his work again. Everyone immediately noticed the boy. He was very exhausted and could hardly stand on his feet. It seems that the work was hard. Everyone unanimously agreed that we need to give this guy more time for himself. He's still a teenager. Eventually, everyone gathered in the common room for a meeting. Another most important problem had to be solved, Jin Edel at the head. The necromancer turned to his deputy. Jung twitched and looked at his boss, ready to answer. Smiling, Jin asked what kind of position he should offer Jung so he wouldn't take offense and do his job. The former Hammer Guild member looked at his new boss in surprise. He didn't quite know what he was talking about. The thing was that Jean wanted to competently distribute the duties so that everyone performs their work qualitatively. A look of fear appeared on Jung's eyes. He didn't know at all what to say in the last guild he was the head of. It seemed to be Hong who was the most surprised that he would decide his own position. For the first time in his life, he was trusted with something like this. For a second, there was silence between them. Jean was the first to speak. So, what are they silent as fish? What positions would they like to assign? First started by Jung. Usually, the hierarchy is divided into several parts. First are the awakened, and second are the ordinary employees, but it is not so important. Then a contract is drawn up on the basis of which a salary is paid on the basis of raids and revenue. Jin looked at Hong and asked him what he wanted to be. The boy twitched and was horrified. He was actually the manager guy, wanted to say something, but Jin decided for him, okay, now Hong will be the director, whatever. The teenager was horrified. I mean, the principal is the most responsible position he's ever taken on. But on the other hand, it was happy news that the former student had now become the guild director. What a joy. But the delight didn't last long. Jean clarified that he would become the director of resource gathering. The kid was petrified in an instant. It would have been better to just call him principal. Everyone else looked sympathetically at the poor teenager who immediately slumped down. Next, Jung said there will be an accounting department of sales support, sales, and management. Looking at the rest of the staff, Jean wondered which of them would fulfill such duties. Looking at the former guild leader, Jin turned to Jung, who looked at his new boss, eagerly awaiting orders. The necromancer decided to give him the position of general manager, which he could handle. Next came Hemin. The man looked happily at his boss. He had decided to become the director of the support department. Jin didn't particularly mind. The employee immediately folded his hands in front of him and said he would try very hard. Next came Hong Fatty, looked warily at the boss, and prepared to receive his position. The man was visibly nervous. There was silence for a second, and then Jin asked why that Fatty was still here. Didn't he leave? Just then, Jung came to Jin's dismay. After all, he himself said that this was the 5th employee in the guild, so the decision changed. But really just need his name to register. Jin wasn't going to accept this Fatty into his guild. What should they do now? Hong began to worry and twirled his head in different directions. He felt incredibly awkward. The necromancer smiled and folded his arms across his chest. The only question Jung had left was how they were even going to hire new employees. But why would they need them? Hearing such a question, the general manager raised an eyebrow in surprise. I mean, why employees to expand the guild? There will be many more awakened, and they will definitely want jobs, but Jin looked at him with a serious look. After a second, the necromancer threw a small piece of paper on the table. Everyone immediately crowded around it. Turns out Jin was doing it all just to get out of the army. He didn't really need the other employees. When Jung picked it up and started reading, the man's face changed beyond recognition, so the guild was only a sham. But why didn't he join the Hammer? If Jung had accepted the VP position, he'd be living like a king. Now he'd be the head of the department. The man was silent and suddenly heard Jean's voice. So why is he silent? Is he embarrassed about something? The necromancer looked at him with a serious look. Why is he silent? But Jung thought he still needed people. Then let him do his job. The general manager would also be in charge of the support department, and then Jung realized what a trap he had fallen into. It didn't seem to be a good fit, but Jin wasn't too embarrassed. He asked if everyone was in agreement, and they all seemed to agree. Meanwhile, only one news item was being broadcast on all the news publishers in Seoul. A new high-ranking awakened one had appeared. Ji-won was lying on the bed staring at her phone. She couldn't believe her old acquaintance had become so famous. The girl started going over all the memories that had passed over the past few days and quickly climbed up from the bed. She immediately blushed, and why is she only thinking about this Jean guy? Suddenly, 2 more people entered the room. The girl was startled and turned her head to follow them. On the doorstep stood 2 women with very shaved faces. Why doesn't Ji-won wear a cap? She's not the only one here, by the way. The girl looked at them with frightened eyes, and the women kept saying to put the cap on immediately. They were even scared. The unfortunate one started to apologize, but her friends immediately came out and started snorting in disgust. It was necessary to move out of this hostel extremely quickly, or the poor girl would not be able to withstand such pressure. Hope, poor thing, lowered her eyes. She had nothing to hope for in such a situation. No one would help or support her. Meanwhile, Min Guy came out of the train, sticking his phone in and looking at the latest news. He pondered, wondering if the girl would at least be surprised to see him in front of the entrance. The time was right. He was done with exams, and Jin had moved out. The boy was standing near the entrance to the dormitory, where the 2 women who were hurting his sister appeared. They were talking to each other and probably saying some not-so-nice things about his sister. The guy looked closer. Min didn't say a word, but just watched them and listened to every word. Min, because he was very polite, didn't get involved in the conversation, but he was extremely uncomfortable that his sister was being talked about like that. Meanwhile, Jin and his new guild were already working on the new dungeon. Hong was toiling in the sweat of his brow. Eventually, the kid said he collected all the jewelry and put it in a small pile Jin was standing next to. The chances of artifacts falling out had decreased, and now it was a bit difficult to find any useful thing, but it was still enough. Even so, they had already taken all the essentials, and it was time to get out of here. Jin looked at the notice. He opened the store, and the entire pile of artifacts evaporated into a haze. As soon as Jin and his company came to the surface, all the other people stirred and immediately ran up to him. Near this dungeon, there were constantly reporters who did not leave for a second to see the legendary player. Among them was Hong Fatty, immediately ran up to the boss and praised him for the good work, but he was doing here. Looking at him, Fatty said that Jung had asked to bring the boss after Jin finished his dungeon. By the way, where's the general manager? Fatty said he went to the public affairs office. But no sooner had he finished than someone shoved him in the shoulder, and the omnipresent reporters almost trampled him. They questioned Jean about how he cleans up the dungeon so fast, what his secret is. The other reporters began to pass by the fat man and asked his boss about the secret, forgetting about the rules of decorum. A bunch of microphones immediately appeared near Jean, and he was very uncomfortable to be in the center of such attention. At the back of the whole thing, Hong was shaking with rage, and he wasn't even allowed to speak at all. Eventually, Fatty couldn't stand it and yelled for them to immediately move away from Jin player tired after working so hard. If they want to ask a question, let them send an official request to the guild. The fat man had become confident for once. He was yelling that if this kept up, they'd be talking to them in the courtroom. The reporters looked at him with frightened eyes, but the fat man did not stop shouting that he had memorized their faces and would always remember them. The fat man got a chance to show off his skills. The man shouted that he was very vindictive and let him get the hell out of here. The reporters finally calmed down, and Jin, not expecting this from this fatty, even cheered up a bit. Approaching him, Fatty offered to go to the car. Jean, a little discouraged, nevertheless agreed, and might really need a rest. All the while, Jin pondered whether this fatty was always this aggressive, or only after he got a good kicking. Hong stood next to him, and asked how Jin knew him so well that he was talking to him like they were good acquaintances. Smiling, Jean replied that the man just sold him a cell phone, that's all, and that's how they met. In the meantime, Hong was furious. He was running somewhere on his own and gritting his teeth in anger. He was annoyed by it all. Only now did Fatty realize why he'd been hired as a punching bag in the first place. Of course he had. He even closed his store to join the damn guild, but now it turns out it's just a sham. But one way or another, you have to stay here. On Jean's lap was a jar of some goodies. The guy stuck his hand in there and took one at a time. A few days later, the Awakened department gave the guy the highest rank. Jin stared at his phone and wondered, The guy saw another awakened one who seemed to be quite strong. His name was Kim Gangle, a truly legendary figure. Suddenly, Hangai walked into the room and asked his boss what else he wanted. The necromancer pointed at the stone reinforcement. As soon as the kid saw what is in the hands of the boss, he was horrified. Each of these stones is worth at least $1 billion. But somehow, Gene suggested his friend try a few and pulled out 3 different colored pebbles. He didn't even understand why his comrade was so surprised. He just gave him the goodies, that's all, even if they were very expensive. Meanwhile, the former student rejoiced to meet this man, the best thing that could happen in his life. Finally, he got rich. Suddenly, another guy came into the room and asked if Jin was here or not. Everyone turned around on him. In front of them stood none other than Ming. The guy had a bad look on his face, as he was apparently worried about something, and looked downcast. Jin was very surprised when he heard that his comrade wanted to talk to him about something. The student asked for a couple of minutes for a second, and there was a pause between them, neither of them knowing where to start the conversation. After a few minutes, the conversation was already over. Hong wondered if that guy Jin had left and was standing near the clothes rack. The kid could see that the visitor was very serious. He probably had something wrong if he came here himself. Finding a new shirt, Gene thought it was a pretty long story, something like a brother's love for his sister or something. The necromancer got dressed and said he'd be out for a while to take care of a couple things, and the friend agreed. Lastly, the guy said he wanted to meet a girl, so it will be too late to wait for him. Hong was very surprised. Did they really have a date for all that he was doing something in the next room and heard everything? It was his great chance to prove his ability. He was entrusted with the job of watering the flowers. As soon as Jin came out of his room, Hong immediately ran up to him, asking the necromancer to stop. Fatty smiled and said that making him an employee was the best decision he had ever made. He was incredibly proud of himself. Even the necromancer wondered why this Fatty was acting like he had a say in the matter. However, Hong was completely confident in his abilities. He pointed a finger at himself and said that he was a professional in such matters. Eventually, Gene was forced to go to a clothing store here. There were many different brands. When Hong walked in, he immediately started to turn his head around and couldn't believe his eyes. This is definitely the Korea where the kid lives. He didn't think there was such a place in the mall. Meanwhile, Gene was already standing in the fitting room being measured. Here came the ubiquitous Hong. It was his idea to go to the mall for new clothes, and Fatty was diligently choosing. Necromancer himself did not understand why all this fuss. He just wants to meet and talk. Why dress up as for a masquerade? An hour earlier, Fatty Sam had suggested going to the store. He naturally heard that the boss was going on a date. The former salesman was like a Casanova telling how to win a girl's attention, even though he himself had never had a serious relationship. However, even though he was inexperienced, Fatty said to do as he said and invited me to go to a place. Gene doesn't understand anything, looked at him what this madman is talking about. What else is a date and impressing a girl? However, Hong was already unstoppable. He smiled and said that cool outfit, this is the first step of a girl. In the end, Hong and Hong stood outside the fitting room and opened their mouths in surprise when they saw their boss. These two forced Gene into the parade suit. The guy was very uncomfortable, and to refuse was somehow embarrassing. Though it's fair to say that the necromancer himself was pleased with his new "only let them be quiet." Running up to him, Fatty simply held out the watch. This is the last element of the lucky image. Jin was about to walk away, but the fat man followed him, and holding out an envelope, told him to take it with him. This madman has mapped out a whole plan of entertainment venues in the capital. He's got it all wrong again. It's not a date. Although, on the other hand, Gene himself wanted to relax, so it's better to listen to him. The guy thanked his comrade and stuffed the sheet behind his groove. At last, they were finally away from him, and Jin could in good conscience go along. Fatty wished him luck. Finally, the fitting was over. A tired Hong plopped down on the couch and sighed heavily where Hong was going to go. But the fat man wasn't going home. He had one more thing to do. The man smiled and scratched his chin. Every time he tries to bring people together, they become couples. Hong didn't know what he was getting at. However, the fat man had already made up his mind. He clenched his fist and said he was going to help the chapter win the girl's attention at any cost. And here even the student wondered to the chapter that he was really going to date her, or how Hong was completely sure that he was. There was not much time left. Fatty moved towards the exit and, saying goodbye to his colleague, said that he would see him on Monday. Hong disappeared so quickly that the principal didn't even have time to say anything last like lightning, even despite his chubby belly. The first thing Fatty decided to do was to call a cab and have a good follow-up with his boss to see how things were going. And now, being in the dormitory, Jiwon came out of the shower. The girl adjusted the towel on her head and was glad that she had survived today. But suddenly, she noticed the phone lying on a nearby shelf and stopped for a second. It turned out that Jean never answered. Poor thing sat down on the bed and started frantically flipping through the phone book. But when she found one of the messages, Ji-won opened her eyes at the announcement. The guy agreed, and so quickly said he would come over soon. His mind began to go into chaos, that he really wanted to ask her out. The girl was boiling over. Come on, there's no such thing as a date with someone like her. Why does Jin have to do this? Suddenly the phone rang with Jean's name on it. The guy acted decisively and decided to call first. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone, and at the other end of the line she heard a familiar voice. Jean said he was already outside her dormitory. Ji-won quickly got up from her seat like lightning and went to the window, and indeed, there was Jean standing in the street right under the window. Besides, the guy was dressed in an elegant suit. He looked simply stunning and was already waving her hand, beckoning her to come closer. Then when the girl was ready, they headed downtown. She was still wondering why Jin had decided to meet so soon. Without a second thought, Jean said he just wanted to give her something. Yeah, and go on a date. As soon as the girl heard about the date, she blushed. And how to understand it? She looked at Jean with surprised eyes and couldn't believe it was true. Maybe he likes it. It was still a little early for dinner, so the necromancer decided to offer her to go to the movies. The girl immediately agreed. She walked too fast and didn't notice when she bumped into the man and immediately apologized. The whole time, Ji-won was holding onto her cap and trying to hide her burn on her forehead, so worried about her scar. Is even cute. Images began to pop into his mind of when they were sitting at the bar, when Hong was also surprised to notice her head. Then they were very drunk, but Jin still held himself together. He thought this girl was very beautiful. While she held onto her cap, Gina decided to ask, does she really care that much about what those around her think? Without waiting for an answer, the guy grabbed her hand and dragged her into the movie theater. Her friend didn't even have time to react in time. Soon they came to a local shop selling various carnival supplies such as masks. When Jean suggested she wear one of them, Ji-won gasped in horror. He was seriously suggesting walking down the street in a mask. He looked at her with a good-natured look and smiled, squinting at her in a way that didn't seem like the guy was joking at all. When the guys came to the local movie theater, all the visitors looked only at them. These two were quite funny and attracted attention. Everyone even thought for a second that it was some celebrities wearing masks to hide their identity. As Jin and her friend walked forward, the girl wondered if they were really going to walk like this all day. The necromancer had a lion mask on his face. Jean looked at her and asked, does she really want to trade with him? But the girl refused. Jin lifted his mask and said they'd be late for the movie at this rate, so they'd have to hurry if they wanted to make it. They were showing some snotty melodrama that was disgusting to watch, which they usually put on in the background. However, our heroes sat in the movie theater and carefully watched every move of the moviegoers. Sitting next to her companion, Ji-won didn't understand what was going on, because they said the tickets had long since sold out. Jean was sitting next to her and munching on popcorn. The guy didn't seem to be paying attention at all and was engrossed in the movie. Yes, indeed, necromancers. I was a little confused when I saw that all the seats were sold out. Well, there's nothing to do. They don't have to watch the movie at all. Girlfriend looked at Jean and smiled, but just in time the option came up. Another visitor came running up to them, wearing a medical mask. The man said he had some business to attend to, so he was selling tickets. Without even waiting for an answer, the man put 2 tickets in Jean's hand and wished him a good time. Immediately, the stranger shifted forward and disappeared from sight. Something about it seemed very strange to Jin Yu. As the necromancer looked at this stranger, something about it seemed familiar. The same chubby face and yellow hair from under the cap. This man turned out to be Hong. Then he went to the front desk and demanded a refund for all seats, except these 2. Even though the cashier was embarrassed, Hong demanded a refund. He had bought it just recently. What is wrong with this crazy person in general? Why is he acting like this? When the movie show was over, our friends went outside. Ji-won was glad it's been a long time since she's been to the movie theaters. Yes, and Jin had a good time too. The guys were about to go home as suddenly they were called by some voice calling Beauty and the Beast. Someone called them. A few steps away from them stood a clown who spun the Wheel of Fortune and offered everyone who wanted to participate. It was free of charge. Jean decided to give it a try, but girlfriend said she was too bad at this sort of thing. Gambling wasn't for her. The girl tried it, but immediately lost. The clown laughed and offered a visitor in a monster mask to try it. After a moment's thought, Jin decided to accept the prospect of playing, and winning some trinket was quite amusing. He lost time after time. For several times already Jin tried, but still all to no avail. The guy even hesitated. In the end, after a few more attempts, Ji-won clapped her hands together, and the girl was still able to win. It was the first time she had ever won something like this, and she was very happy. The clown congratulated them on their winnings and handed them a small box with the president. It would be a prize. Looking closer, Jean saw a very familiar facial outline in this clown. Could it be that he had hit some bullshit again? Yeah, it was Hoon too, you guessed it. And what's he trying to accomplish by following Jin Ohm? In the end, the necromancer got fed up with it and decided to hurriedly retreat before Hong wished them luck. Next, they went to another amusement machine where there was a claw to pull out a small toy. After all this needed to go get some refreshment, the guys went to a local restaurant and ordered gourmet meals. Jean paid for everything. Eventually, their walk came to an end. The couple strolled through the local park, wondering how much time had eventually passed. Ji-won looked at everything around her through the mask. Of course, she was worried about what the people around her would say, but since wearing the mask, everything has changed. If Jin hadn't done it with her, she wouldn't have even dared to think about it. But it was okay now. If this was a dream, then she would never want to wake up. Jin looked at her with a smile on his face. The guy was very pleased. Everything had worked out for the best. Eventually, they sat down on a nearby bench and started discussing. Everyone enjoyed it very much. Although people certainly thought they were weird for wearing masks in such a public place. It looked funny. From beneath the lion's mask came Jin's smile. Yeah, what's the big deal? Let them think they're weird, that's their problem. Her friend stood her ground and agreed with Jin Ohm, but she still lacks the courage to admit it. It's like a dream to her. The girl lifted her head up and looked with drawn eyes at the sky. Time to take off the masks and return to reality with trembling hands. Ji-won took off her cartoon girl mask and sighed. In front of her stood Jin. In a good-natured voice, he said to make the girl regain her courage again. He decided to give her one last little something. Her eyes rounded, and her friend looked at him, not thinking there would be anything else. No sooner had the guy finished what he wanted to say than suddenly an explosion was heard in the sky. Bright lights began to fall like a starfall. Where did you come from? Some strange people started congratulating the couple for some reason. They stood with the flowers, but suddenly people looked at the girl's face in surprise and started to raise their eyebrows. Unhappy Ji-won is facing the same thing again, what she feared the most, but this guy must really love her. Hong was standing behind a nearby tree, shaking with rage. He said it was just to diffuse the atmosphere. What are these madmen doing? Something went, obviously. Not according to plan. People were talking amongst themselves. The girl's face startled them again. The same story. Jin himself, pulling on his mask, boiled with anger. This madman Hong really arranged all this. For their sake, this is some kind of masquerade. But that wasn't the main problem right now. The guy looked at his friend. Ji-won stood back and lowered her head, looking in front of her. Suddenly, a bone wall appeared around them, and people jumped aside in fear to save their lives. Finding herself in such a strange place, the frightened girl drove her eyes around and tried to understand what had just happened. In front of her stood Jean. She listened only to his voice. The guy was telling her friend to close her eyes. He had a present. Ji-won blushed instantly from embarrassment, but still obeyed and closed her eyes. It all looked like some kind of dream. The events shifted to a few hours ago. When Jin En was talking to Min, the guy wanted to talk about his sister. At the time when the first dungeon girl appeared, she stopped doing what she wanted for her brother's sake. She was hurt by a monster. That's when her scar appeared, which serves as a reminder of those terrible events. Taking some sort of bottle of a miracle potion out of her pocket, Jin seemed like she was about to wake up from her sleep. A bright light flashed for a second. The guy touched his fingers to Ji-won's scar, and she felt some strange aura spreading throughout her body. It was some sort of healing potion. The girl looked in front of her with frightened eyes, but didn't dare to take a step back. Then she was already at home, and sitting on the couch, Jin ordered her not to wash her face for a day, or her dream would continue again. The girl reached for the small bag next to her, but what she saw there shocked her even more as her eyes widened and her heart began to pound even harder. In a small box lay a ring with a gemstone. But how did they manage to win this? There's no way that could be. All the things that happened before all those flowers, watching a movie and having dinner together, it can't be that Ji-won blushed even more. Was Jin going to confess his feelings to her then? It shocked the girl. In fact, the worst fate befell the unfortunate Hong, as if he were doing push-ups and counting out loud. Because of his physique, it was very difficult, but the fat man still tried. He repeated only one word. You must know the measure. Suddenly, Jin turned to him, and Hong flashed to his feet, straightening up like a soldier. He waited for the next orders. Surprisingly, Jin wasn't angry. He just asked why Hoon did it. No one asked him to. Why pry into someone else's life? In a crying voice, Fatty said that he just wanted to prove his loyalty and help his master achieve his goal. This amused Jin. The necromancer smiled and said one last time to just know the measure. And so it's no big deal. When asked where he got all that money to buy these things, Hong scratched the back of his head and said he just took the guild card. Jin's goodwill was gone, and he again ordered the fat man to lie down and do push-ups until he lost his pulse. Suddenly, there was a knock, and Jung entered the room. He was holding a cell phone and saying that he just wanted to call his boss. When the general manager saw Hong doing push-ups, he was very surprised to see what he was doing here. But it didn't matter now anyway. Jung said he'd managed to get a deal with the Defense Department so he wouldn't have to serve. But still, it will be necessary to perform a dozen mobilization assignments from the army, but there was still some nuance. The manager hesitated. This was nonsense, that the manager didn't even know how to talk about Jean looked at him with an even more serious look, and listened, but no longer languid. In a trembling voice, Jung said he was asked to join the army immediately. They even gave the exact address of where the next dungeon breakthrough occurred as one of the stations in the city. In half an hour, Jean was already there. There were no people on the street. It seemed that the whole neighborhood was completely deserted, just like a ghost town. The thing was that the barrier fault was just around the corner, and then the monsters might break out, and the situation would risk becoming critical. Jung continued to talk, and no one has ever managed to clear this station. Even the most experienced fighters have given up before halfway through. But after saying that, Jin also became visibly worried. What would happen if they failed? They weren't all strong after all. For now, the army will not engage. But if it continues like this, the neighborhood will be completely wiped out. And so, our hero was already standing on the deserted street, wondering why there are so many parks and different places for entertainment. As if reading his thoughts, a stern voice was heard behind his back, and the woman said that the breakup would take place tomorrow afternoon. In front of him stood a woman in a military uniform. She introduced herself as First Lieutenant Cho Hai Seo. She seemed to be in charge here. Jin shook hands with her and also introduced himself. The girl said she was honored to meet such a distinguished man. The necromancer only sighed. No need for all these formalities. He came here on business. So what's the problem? What does he have to do? In addition, the necromancer was extremely surprised to learn that it was possible to use items to return and come back even during a raid. However, in one dungeon, such a thing could only be done 3 times. Jin was very surprised, and that it was possible to do so. The first floor was attempted to be cleared by experienced players from the Faran Guild, but failed and barely made it back alive. Then they teamed up together with the Hammer Guild, but also failed. The monsters were too strong. After this, the International Defense Forces have already joined, but even they could not go further than half. Heiseo said it's very risky, and no one says they're willing to give their life for an unlikely mission. But on the other hand, Jin assumed that it would be more dangerous if the dungeon did rupture, then a lot of people would be hurt. Jin was already well aware that the difficulty of the dungeon was also affected by the terrain, and the monsters, there weren't too strong. So the girl soldiers were sure that they will manage. Her enthusiasm can only be envied. They also have the advantage. All you have to do is use modern weapons and combat equipment. Jin understood all of this, but he had a question about why Haiseo was called in. But the awakened ones were also important to the fight. While the main defense forces in the army are making destruction of monsters, they will provide full support in case the forces are not equal. Worse, they don't know anything about the boss of this dungeon, so you have to prepare for the worst beforehand. Maybe he's too strong. After a short story, the soldier offered to go to the waiting room. The rest of the awakened were already in place and waiting for them. As soon as the doors opened, an interesting picture appeared before the heroes inside. There were already a lot of people. All of them were awakened. As soon as everyone else saw that Jin himself had joined them, they were very much surprised. Could this guy also participate in the mission? Surprisingly, turning his head in different directions, the necromancer saw a familiar face and stopped for a second to look closer. Here they met again. In front of him stood Yunhee, the girl leaning against the wall and looking at him with the same disdainful gaze. They seemed to be brought together by fate itself. Jin even smiled slightly. It looked rather strange from the outside. But his rival just looked at the guy and called only his name. She seemed to realize that the balance of power had changed. Before going on this operation, Yunhee received a special assignment from her supervisor. It was a top-secret mission. But when the girl heard the purpose of the operation, her eyes widened in surprise and a chill ran down her spine. Sung-ho looked at her and smiled at the man, asking if she could handle such a task or if she should assign it to someone else. Of course she agreed, and here Yunhee was already standing at the site of the operation and waiting for the right moment. The woman tried not to give herself away. As if on purpose, Jin started taunting. He apologized for breaking into that dungeon, but it wasn't much of a challenge. Though she wouldn't be able to do it alone, right? The guy smirked again and looked at her with an extreme sarcastic look. Yunhee stepped closer and raised an eyebrow in surprise, as if she had just beaten him yesterday, but the boy was much stronger now. After this, the people sitting in the building started to look at each other. Could it be that these two had fought before and she had defeated him? This was something Jin definitely didn't expect. He hissed curses between his teeth. It was too much. An aura began to form around the guy. Does she really want to test how strong Jintail has become in the meantime? A feud began to form between the two. Haiseo, standing between them, tried to reconcile the two monsters, or else there would be a disaster. The red-haired girl looked at her rival and smirked. But although he had matured, he was still a child. Let's just not get cocky. Jin looked at her with a surprised look, but while true, his mistake could get people hurt. These words began to taunt the necromancer more and more. He was already raring to fight, but the girl fighter tried to stop him. Yunhee, this is the leader of the support team. She can't just be fought with by the military trying to stop the evil necromancer. In the end, Jin did calm down a bit, but he still stared fiercely at his rival. The frightened Haiseo sighed heavily as she finally managed to subdue the monster, or else the whole plan would go to waste. By the way, Jean had some more question. The girl looked at him with surprised eyes and started blinking. The necromancer asked her to get some information about this dungeon. Anything would do. Seeing the confusion on the girl's face, the necromancer wondered if this was some kind of state secret that couldn't be spoken about directly. But Haiseo said it's even available information. Maybe he wants it printed out in writing. Yunhee was watching closely. Hearing that this guy wanted information about the dungeons gave the girl goosebumps. He's not going to go there alone. But it was still. A few hours later, when everyone had let their guard down, Jin was standing near the entrance to the 6th-ranked dungeon. The guy stood looking at the portal as he was suddenly distracted by someone's very familiar voice calling out to him. Looking up, the necromancer noticed Yunhee. The girl was standing at the top of the steps, asking what he was doing here. Hearing that this madman wants to go there alone made the girl cold with fear. He really doesn't realize how serious it is. Not at all. Jean was well aware of it. He's not some madman. It was part of his plan. With excitement in his voice, Yunhee said that a team of top players had tried 3 times to win this place, but always failed. Did he have so much confidence? She wanted to say something else, but Jin rudely interrupted her by telling her to shut her mouth at last. He started to tease her. Yunhee instantly boiled with rage. Yes, what does he allow himself? Even a short while ago, he was nothing at all. Reaching forward towards the dungeon, Jin called her a scaredy cat and moved a couple steps forward. But something like this, Yunhee definitely couldn't stand it. She frowned and gritted her teeth. Yes, what is he even allowing himself? Meanwhile, in his private office, Sun Ho was playing billiards when suddenly he received a phone call from the minister. The man picked up the phone and started talking. As the man talked, his face changed. The speech was about his sister. The minister wanted to know what it all meant. As it turned out, Yunhee was in the dungeon. She followed Jin Om. The girl didn't want to cede leadership to this kid. The necromancer himself stood with his summoned skeletons and prepared to fight, already wearing some clothes. She'd thought this guy was just some crazy guy who decided to go into the dungeon alone, but now everything was falling into place. She stood on a small path and watched everything from afar, trying not to arouse suspicion. A huge orc-like monster with a large club rushed at Jin. A guy with his level won't be able to clear this dungeon, not to mention the stone. The monster swung around and struck directly at the army, and the skeletons heard a cracking sound of warriors flying in different directions. The monster swung around and struck directly at the army, and the skeletons heard a cracking sound of warriors flying in different directions. Suddenly, Golem Jin appeared from the ground, just in time to recognize him, and ordered an immediate attack. The guy swung his arm, and the monster immediately lunged straight at his next target. The huge golem crashed right into the monstrous monster, and a deafeningly loud rumble was heard. The two monsters were not inferior to each other in size. As Golem pushed the monsters aside, Jin took advantage of the moment and rushed straight at him, pushing away from his servant. The ghost hammer appeared in the guy's hands. It shone with a blue glow, and the necromancer prepared to strike. Next, a pop was heard, more like an explosion. Jin swung around and hit the hammer right on the monster's head level raised. Great, after destroying such a large monster, Jin raised several levels at once. The guy smiled. Nearby stood Bibi. The girl cheered her master's excellent handling of such monsters, which was to be expected. She hugged the huge giant and said, "Rocky did a good job too." The monster smiled and blushed a little. The necromancer wondered very much what other Rocky she had time to name him, or that she was watching too much TV, probably. It's time to stop fooling around and move forward. Jin moved deeper into the woods, and the others followed him. But they did not pass, and a couple of dozen meters, as in front of friends, showed a huge cliff. It was so deep that the bottom is almost invisible. Jin was dumbfounded for a second, and Bibi stopped behind him, looking forward with a frightened look, and not understanding what was going on. The thing is, Jin had already heard of it in the ancient legends, about the coming of the sacred place of Alphen. It was some sort of urban legend. It was the Tarta Plateau, a huge cluster of rocks scattered chaotically amongst themselves, and getting through it would be a challenge. The Temple of Giants guys were still standing near the huge gorge and thinking how to cross to the other side. Now would be a good time to try something. Jin opened the notification window to unlock a special advantage. He had learned soul extraction when he was treating his friend Hong, a rather useful skill that had come in handy in battle. Applying his new skill, the guy began to summon his wandering spirits from the bodies of the defeated monsters, began to ooze energy. Excellent. Now we need to continue. The necromancer's body has begun to overflow with energy, and soon a new weapon will be born. In the end, a huge blade finally appeared in Jin's hands, finally a normal weapon, and that is already tired of running with this stick. Seeing this in front of her, Bibi smiled, and her eyes widened even more. The necromancer, along with his retinue, stood, and before him a bright purple light spilled out. Someone was born, some new creature. Not even a couple of seconds later, a huge ghost rider with purple fur appeared before the eyes of those present. Bibi immediately rushed to hug her pet, named Shin. The girl missed her old friend very much. They didn't have time for a touching reunion. They needed to cross the plateau faster. The necromancer looked ahead. Eventually, they both sat on the horse and rushed forward. The ghostly horse literally flew through the air without feeling gravity. Another monster didn't take long to arrive. A huge monster rushed at the aliens and tried to kill them. In front of him stood Yunhee's only girl. She stood in her place and did not move while the monster came closer and closer. Making one big tug, the girl made several holes in the monster. The monster immediately fell to the ground. There was a rumbling sound. Yunhee stopped in her place and breathed heavily. Coping with this monster wasn't very difficult. This place must be somewhere around here. The girl walked a few meters and, hiding behind the nearest tree, peeked out ahead. What she saw threw her eyes open in slight shock, and the girl would take a closer look. There was something up there. Something was flying from afar. It looked like a huge horse, but someone had thought of summoning something like that. Looking closer, Yunhee saw Jin, who was sitting on his ghostly flying pet. This guy had a lot of surprises. But she also needs at least some way to get to another place. The girl threw a huge rope on the rock and prepared to jump. The reason why this dungeon was rarely descended was because only those who could fly could cross this place. But that wasn't all. The trials behind the cliff were 3 monsters that guarded the place. Once they saw them, all the others surrendered. When the guildmaster talked to the minister, it was decided to let the dungeon burst. The place will be destroyed, but still, it is the best solution. Yunhee herself was not interested in political affairs and entrusted it all to her master. Such decisions should only be made by that person. But now the girl decided to take matters into her own hands. She looked in front of her with a serious look. Now Jin would see what she was capable of. It was necessary to stop him. Yunhee climbed up, holding onto the rope. The girl was moving incredibly fast. With only an hour left before the dungeon ruptured, there was already a warning notice for everyone else to evacuate as a matter of urgency. President Seong-ho called an emergency press conference where the most prominent people in the Korean government were present, and they were all interested in only one question. The president himself was sure that Jin had no chance to get out of this dungeon alive. One of the attendees provocatively asked how the president even feels about it. There lived his sister. The man sighed heavily and put his hands on his head. That seriously, a member of his family is on the verge of life, is not the time for such questions. Heavy thoughts visited the man's head. He sighed heavily and lowered his eyes to admit the president didn't know what to say. The man was already very tired and decided to stop the press conference, but the others wanted to know better. They wanted to know the details. Eventually, the press conference ended. Another guard showed up and praised the president for his work, but the man was curious about the dungeon. After learning that the barrier was not answering now, Song-ho smiled as he went to the main building, and a smile appeared on the man's face. The employee shakily agreed, but he was terrified. Is the president happy about this? Even though this man is the head of the company, but his indifference and coldness is a bit scary, even when it comes to a family member. They went out the back door. The rest of the people had already evacuated in a hurry, and there were pesky journalists everywhere. Sang-ho raised an eyebrow in surprise at who these people were, and it turned out they were members of Jin's newfound guild. Among them was the general manager, Jung. He demanded to be let inside immediately, but the military were adamant. While in the dungeon, Jin along with Bebe had already crossed the canyon without much trouble and were on the other side. Somehow it was creepy here. There were stone statues everywhere like those on Easter Island. Maybe they'll turn into golems in time. Nothing to do. Jin ordered his golem to try and break one of them, and then we'll see what happens. One of the statues began to move. Eventually it turned into a large golem. The monster got down on one knee in front of its new master, and it turns out it's just an ordinary rock. Eventually, the rest of the stats also began to wake up. They came closer and closer to the stranger's level they had incredibly high. There were 5 of them here. Jin only smiled a great idea to fight such strong monsters. Now he could feel his strength. Another problem was that these creatures had no souls, so they couldn't be used as warriors. Since that's the case, the only thing left is to destroy them. Jin summoned his ghost hammer in a second and grasped the weapon. A triumphant smile appeared on his face, meaning it was time to increase his warrior class, a great idea to test the abilities. While the fight was going on below, Yunhee stood on one of the branches of the tree and watched the scene from the side uninterruptedly. Until now, she thought this guy was a necromancer, so why is he fighting in close combat similar to a warrior? As she expected, all these statues turned out to be golems, and they immediately began to attack anyone who entered their territory. If a person carelessly approaches the altar, the monsters will immediately surround him and destroy him. Now, at least, this is known. Watching Jin fighting alone with huge monsters, the girl wondered involuntarily to herself. His reflexes were much better. The necromancer himself continued to destroy the monsters. They were not very strong, they were just too many. The guy looked closer and saw 3 more monsters in the distance. They were already some kind of monsters. They stood much closer to the altar. These 3 had scared Jean from the start. They looked like Cyclops from fantasy, stood in a circle around the altar and guarded. The faces of these monsters were extremely unfriendly. One of them frowned his only eye and looked at the uninvited guests. There was a clang of a hammer and the crunch of stone, and another golem was defeated by the hammer. This was the last. Golem Bebe was the most excited. Finally, they had gotten a handle on these monsters. They could move on. The return stone has begun to glow even more, which means the explosion will happen soon. We have to get there before disaster strikes. They didn't have time for that. For the first time in a long time, goosebumps ran down Jean's back, and he realized that temporarily they were coming from him. The only ones left were these 3 Cyclops monsters, originated from a race of ancient giants, incredibly strong, agile, and tough, serious opponent. Of course, these monsters come from the same race as the ogres, but they are not so cruel and mindless. Worse, they have intelligence. Cyclops inherited the wisdom of their ancient giant ancestors. These creatures used to thrive as a separate race. Due to their intelligence and ingenuity, they have reached considerable heights. One of the Cyclops looked at the named guests with a single eye and said that he didn't expect to see them here. Jen raised an eyebrow upward and smirked. Did the monsters know him? Cyclops nodded his head affirmatively. The monster must have been referring to Bibi, and the girl raised an eyebrow in surprise. So there's also a Musclehead Necromancer here. Jin smiled coming out. He's quite a famous person here. Making a serious face, Cyclops frowned. How could he ever forget a person like he had Jin? Don't put any more ranting. The monsters decided to attack Jin, prepared himself. He realized that this was about to be a very dangerous fight. The Cyclops swung his huge mace a few paces closer and charged it with energy, aiming it at Jin. Rocky, seeing all this, roared with rage and rushed to the aid of his master. The giant was furious. The huge was hit right in the unfortunate giant's head. There was a cracking sound, but fortunately, Golem remained alive. The 3 Cyclops stopped a few steps away from their victims and froze in place, looking at the strange creature. Looking at his opponents, Jin asked, could it be that they too were sent here by the demon? Cyclops tensed up and looked in front of him. The necromancer became very angry when he heard what Cyclops monster said, saying that by escaping from the netherworld, Jin had already lost. Besides, his anger only proves his impending defeat. The monster, despite his savagery, was extremely intelligent. With a smile on his face, Jin advised him not to take on too much. He is, after all, a creature who is going to the other world. The silhouette of a guy holding his spear was reflected in the Cyclops' eye, and he was moving straight at him. A crunch was heard on Jean's face, and again, a smile appeared on his face as he hit his target. The giant grabbed his huge hands together and did a little lock like he was trying to punch. With his huge hands, the giant grabbed the boy and began to squeeze him with such force that he finally crushed him like an insect. But suddenly, the giant's fingers separated from his hand in a flash, and a cracking sound was heard as Jin broke free. The guy jumped to the ground. What a strange world it was. He hit the spear right in the eye of this huge monster. Worse, Cyclops had incredible regeneration. He grew new fingers in no time and was as good as new. He was too strong. Being on the surface, people who were involved with the newly formed guild wanted to know what was wrong with its leader. Further conversation was meaningless among those present, was also Jiwon. The girl was very worried and did not find herself. She had only the image of Jin in her mind and hoped that the boy would be all right, because they had grown closer over the past few days. The poor girl lowered her head and almost started crying. Min looked at her and stood by her brother, who unfortunately couldn't do anything. Folding her hands in front of her, the girl began to pray it was the only thing she could do right now, begging all the gods for her friend to survive. Meanwhile, a fierce fight was going on in the dungeon. 3 Cyclops were trying to destroy the invaders, while Yoonhee stood in the distance and watched. With their huge bodies and almost instant regeneration, Cyclops are considered almost invincible monsters in this situation. Even an experienced fighter like Yoonhee didn't know how to deal with these monsters alone. Jin is truly a madman, so what is he going to do? The Necromancer tried dozens of blows, but it was all to no avail. It's crazy how resilient these titans are. To his horror, the guy realized that he had never heard that Cyclops had such powerful regeneration before. It was even somehow unfair. Necromancer was wary. He began to guess about something because the truth is, the guy fighting monsters on their land, obviously they will be stronger. Looking at the huge statue, Jin thought of something and ordered BB and the giant distract those monsters as much as possible. The girl was horrified and how she was even going to stop these monsters, but Jin just stroked her head and said he was relying on her. The little witch is terrified. Looks like her boss is out of his mind. The monsters will wipe them out. The Cyclops had already started to come closer and closer. The monsters noticed the new prey and wanted to squash it like a gnat. When the witch looked up at them, she began to beg them to stop for a second. Meanwhile, the Necromancer himself was already standing on the head of this huge statue. It was so big that it was impossible not to notice it. One of the Cyclopes immediately noticed that his sanctuary was being attacked by some lowly man and immediately rushed to the defense of the god. And Jin just looked at them and smiled. He just got through security. Why are they pouting so much? This only infuriated the huge giant. He roared with rage and rushed to defend his shrine. Immediately, there was an earthquake under the pressure of natural phenomenon. The statue began to collapse and crumble into small pieces. When the giant saw this sacrilege, he became furious and wanted to destroy anyone who touched the statue, much less this lowly man. But immediately an explosion was heard. The giant felt a powerful blow directly into his chest and flew back a few meters shrieking in pain. Now the blows were working properly. Jin was pleased, -1 monster. There were 2 more to deal with. In the end, only 2 giants remained. One of them lay with his head separated. And Jin was only happy to let them all attack together if they were sure they could defeat him, a smile shining on his face. In the end, when all the monsters were defeated, Jin opened the notification window. He received a giant's tear as a reward for his victory. The guy was already starting to get lost in all these skills, but he thought that it was not so important just to win. It was time to go back. The guys stood near the defeated giants and pondered what they should do next. The only thing left was to take the Crystal of Return. But suddenly the altar was empty of those who had already taken their loot, as if a ghost had appeared from somewhere. They both turned and saw a familiar silhouette at their backs, someone standing behind them and chuckling. It was only now that the couple saw the very same crystal in the hands of a girl very familiar to them, the stone gleaming in the sun. In front of them stood Yoonhee herself, smiling and asking if they were looking for him. It was obvious that she wasn't going to give him up so easily. Gina's already starting to get really pissed off. This girl's following him upstairs now here. Don't get bored yet. Before that, Yoonhee heard a mission she needed to get Jin to infiltrate the dungeon before the explosion. No one knew his background or abilities. They needed to put him in extreme conditions, and only then would they be able to figure out what was wrong. She was to observe Jin's skills and abilities to eventually learn everything. Does anyone help him whatsoever? This man, and when she finds out, let him come back. After that, Yoonhee was visibly upset to be tailing him again, and someone ranked lower than her could take care of this thing. But no, her brother claimed she was the only one with enough experience not to go to the other side of the world in that place. Never mind how this guy managed to launch his guild. Soon it will take over the dungeon market in all of Korea, if not the world. And now Yoonhee stood before her target and pondered how best to get rid of him before the guy gained even more strength and power. She grinned and asked, wondering if Jin had really cleared this dungeon by himself. She'd thought all along that the Necromancer was using some kind of trick, but now she had to admit that the guy was pretty strong. Jin didn't seem to care. The dungeon will collapse soon enough. Let him give up the Crystal of Return and get out of here if he wants to live. Naturally, Yoonhee was not going to leave so easily. The girl rushed straight at him and swung her blade to strike the first blow. Jin was furious that this mad woman was doing this to her, that she was sick of living in a dungeon that was falling apart, and she was fighting here. The girl's face changed. She became as if Mad Yoonhee said that she had her reasons, and she couldn't let get out of here alive. Upstairs in the real world, the guild members were having their own battle as they tried to penetrate the dungeon, but were suddenly thwarted by Spun Ho. The man stood in front of them in his own right, and looked at what was happening with a serious look. He was very gold. Jung ran up to him and said that he was a member of the guild Jin was in and that he had the right to know what had happened to him. The foreman grimaced that this man that his employees do not understand any hints at all, very unfortunate. Fixing his glasses on his nose, Sang-ho said that the dungeon was about to explode, so it was better to move to a safe distance. From such insolence, Jung was speechless. What is all this means? His boss is there, and he is rather in danger. Hong intervened in the conversation. Why would this dungeon explode? Jin will now clean it up and remove the barrier. The guy's mood was most determined, even though he was talking to a man above him in rank. Everything happened exactly as Hong had anticipated. The military began to notice that the barrier disappears in the dungeon stopped reacting. This simply can't be, he is already here. Jin came. Sang-ho, with surprised eyes, looked in the direction of what is even happening there. It is impossible. An hour ago, there was a real duel between Jin-Ohm and Yunhee. The girl fought like a monster. She was doing everything she could to not let him out of here.